At my father's lavish retirement dinner, he raised his crystal glass to the room of 200 elite guests and declared that a man's true legacy is only carried by the children who make him proud. The room erupted in applause. Then his smile vanished. He turned his cold gaze directly to my table, pointed his finger at me, and ordered me to leave. As I stood up, my husband grabbed my hand, stood beside me, and set off a chain of events that would strip my father of everything he owned by midnight. I am Kendra, 35 years old and a forensic accountant who spent her entire life trying to earn the love of a family that only saw me as a burden. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. Trust me, you will want to hear how I handled what came next. The grand ballroom of the Oak Ridge Country Club in Atlanta was a masterclass in wealth and intimidation. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over tables covered in crisp white linen and expensive floral arrangements. The air was thick with the scent of roasted prime rib, expensive perfume, and the quiet hum of old money. 200 of the city's most influential business owners, local politicians, and high society figures were gathered tonight for one reason. They were here to celebrate my father, Winston. He was stepping down as the CEO of a highly lucrative regional logistics and freight empire. It was a company he built from the ground up, and he never let anyone forget it. Tonight was supposed to be his crowning achievement, his glorious transition into retirement. I sat at table number 24, a small circular table tucked away near the kitchen doors, far away from the VIP section at the front of the room. I was wearing a modest navy blue dress, gripping a simple manila envelope in my hands. It was my retirement gift to him. Beside me sat my husband Malcolm, looking sharp in his dark suit, his eyes constantly scanning the room with the quiet intensity of a man who missed nothing. Winston stepped up to the podium on the main stage. The ambient chatter of the room died down instantly. He adjusted his tailored tuxedo, smoothed his silver tie, and tapped the microphone. He commanded the room effortlessly, just as he had commanded our household for decades. He began his speech with grand, sweeping statements about hard work, sacrifice, and the heavy burden of leadership. He spoke about building an empire that would outlast him, a legacy that would echo through generations. Then he turned his attention to the front table. His voice softened with a pride I had never once heard directed at me. He raised his glass toward my younger brother, Trey. He called Trey the future of the company, the brilliant young vice president who would take the helm tomorrow morning and steer the family business to even greater heights. Trey smirked, raising his own glass in return, soaking in the applause. My father then gestured to my older sister Jasmine and her husband Dion, praising them for their elegance, their real estate ventures, and for upholding the pristine image of our family name in the community. The applause swelled again. I clapped along, my hands feeling numb. I had spent 35 years watching him lavish affection and financial support on them, while I was left to fend for myself. I paid my own way through state college while he funded Trey's $500,000 private university education. I built my career from scratch while Jasmine lived off a massive trust fund. But tonight I had come to offer an olive branch. I had come to show him respect despite a lifetime of being treated like an outsider in my own home. As the applause faded, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Winston's posture stiffened, and his eyes scanned the crowd until they locked onto me in the back corner. The warm paternal smile melted away, replaced by a look of utter disdain. The microphone amplified his deep voice as he spoke his next words. "A strong tree is only as healthy as its roots," he said, staring right at me. "And sometimes to protect the tree you have to prune the dead branches. You have to remove the parts that drain your resources and bring shame to the aesthetic of your garden. I only claim the children who reflect my greatness. I only claim the ones who belong in this room." A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the banquet hall. 200 pairs of eyes began to follow his gaze, turning in their chairs to look at me. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. "Kendra," he barked, his voice echoing off the walls. "You are a disruption to this family and you do not belong at this celebration. Leave, now." The public humiliation was a physical blow. It felt as though all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. My cheeks burned with a fiery heat and my vision blurred for a fraction of a second. This was not just a rejection. This was an execution of my dignity in front of the entire elite community of Atlanta. I looked down at the manila envelope in my hands, feeling incredibly foolish. I had spent weeks preparing this gift, poring over financial documents, ensuring every single detail was perfectly arranged for him. And now I was being thrown out like trash. I swallowed the lump in my throat, tight and painful. The instinct to flee, to hide my face, and run out the kitchen doors was overwhelming. I began to push my chair back, preparing to walk away in silence to give him exactly what he wanted. But before I could stand up fully, I felt a strong, warm hand wrap around my wrist. It was Malcolm. He did not look angry. He looked entirely calm, which was far more dangerous. He stood up slowly, pulling me gently to stand beside him. He did not break eye contact with my father on the stage. He held my hand tightly, anchoring me to the floor, refusing to let me retreat into the shadows. Before I could even take a breath to process the shock of my father's words, my mother. Brenda leaned across the table. The heavy scent of her expensive gardenia perfume washed over me, making my stomach turn. Her face was twisted into a tight, perfectly manicured mask of polite society, but her eyes were filled with pure venom. She did not reach out to comfort me. She did not defend her daughter against her husband's public cruelty. Instead, she grabbed my wrist with her long acrylic nails, digging into my skin. "Do not you dare make a scene, Kendra," she hissed, her voice barely a whisper so the surrounding tables could not hear. "Just turn around and walk out the back doors quietly. You have already ruined the aesthetic of our table tonight by showing up in that cheap off-the-rack dress. The Hendersons are sitting 2 tables away, and they are already staring. Do not embarrass us any further, just go." I stared at my mother, feeling a cold, hollow space open up in my chest. For a brief second, I wondered how a mother could look at her own child with such deep disgust simply because my presence threatened her fragile high society image. But before I could pull my arm away from her grip, a shadow fell over our table. My older sister Jasmine and her husband Dayon had slipped out of their chairs at the front VIP section and marched over to us. They positioned themselves purposefully in the narrow aisle between the banquet tables, physically blocking my only path to the exit. Jasmine stood tall in a custom beaded gown that cost more than some people's cars, her arms crossed over her chest. Dayon stood right beside her, puffing out his chest with the smug arrogance of a man who thought his leased luxury car made him royalty. They looked like 2 bouncers protecting a nightclub, but their only job tonight was to ensure I left with my head hanging in shame. Jasmine looked me up and down with a slow, dramatic sneer. Her eyes stopped on the simple manila envelope I was holding. She let out a sharp, cruel laugh that cut through the low murmur of the dining room. "What is that, Kendra?" she asked, pointing a diamond-covered finger at the folder. "Please tell me you did not bring Dad another pathetic handmade card. Are you going to ask him to put it on the refrigerator?" I tightened my grip on the envelope, but I did not speak. I let her continue her performance. "Or maybe it is another loan application," she mocked, leaning closer to me. "Is that it? Are you finally admitting that your cheap state school degree was a complete waste of time? Dad is retiring tonight, Kendra. He is done handing out charity. He is not going to bail you out of your student loans just because you decided to show up here looking like a desperate intern. You need to figure out your own finances and stop trying to leech off his success." The hypocrisy of her words was staggering. Jasmine had never worked a real job a single day in her 38 years of life. She lived entirely off a massive trust fund my father had set up for her, playing the role of a wealthy socialite while treating everyone around her like the help. And yet here she was, accusing me of being the parasite. I had paid for every single credit hour of my education by working double shifts and skipping meals. I was a self-made woman. But in their eyes, I would always be the poor failure who was not good enough for private tuition. Dayon decided it was his turn to chime in. He adjusted his expensive watch, making sure it caught the light from the chandeliers overhead. Look, Kendra, he said, shaking his head with mock pity. Jasmine is right. We are operating on a different level now. I am closing massive real estate deals every week, and Trey is taking over the logistics empire tomorrow. We are building generational wealth. We simply do not have the time or the energy to deal with your financial struggles anymore. It is dragging the whole family down. You need to take your little paperwork and exit through the kitchen before security has to get involved. I looked at Dion taking in his designer suit and his arrogant smile. It took every ounce of my professional self-control not to laugh right in his face. He loved playing the role of the big-shot real estate mogul, relying heavily on my father's money to fund his flashy lifestyle. He truly believed he was untouchable. He had no idea that I knew exactly where his money was actually coming from. My mother let go of my wrist and smoothed out the napkin on her lap, pretending to be completely unbothered by the hostility her oldest daughter was projecting. Just listen to your sister Kendra, Brenda said, waving her hand dismissively. Go home. We will send you a slice of the retirement cake if there is any left over. They all stood there waiting for me to break. They expected the familiar routine. They expected me to lower my eyes, apologize for breathing their air, and scurry away into the night feeling worthless. For 35 years, that was exactly how this dynamic played out. They would push, and I would fold. But tonight was different. The woman standing before them was no longer a scared little girl seeking their validation. I felt Malcolm's hand tighten around mine, a silent, steady stream of support. He did not yell or try to push past Dion. He simply stood tall, radiating the kind of quiet power that made Dion's fake bravado look absolutely pathetic. I looked at my mother, then at Jasmine, and finally at Dion. I did not drop my gaze. I held the manila envelope against my side, feeling the weight of the federal documents resting safely inside. The paper felt heavy with justice. They thought I was drowning in student loans. They thought I was a failure. They had no idea that I was a senior partner at the top forensic accounting firm in the state, and that this envelope held the destruction of their entire fake empire. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp air of the country club fill my lungs. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Let them talk, I thought to myself. Let them dig their graves as deep as they possibly can. Because when the truth comes out, there will be nowhere left for them to hide. Malcolm did not move a single inch toward the exit. Instead, he squared his shoulders and locked his gaze on my father, who was still standing at the podium bathing in the uncomfortable silence of the banquet hall. The sheer audacity of my family expecting us to retreat like beaten dogs was finally about to blow up in their faces. Before I reveal exactly what was hiding inside this plain manila envelope and how my husband wiped that smug smile off my brother's face, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Have you ever had a partner stand up for you when your own blood threw you to the wolves? Drop a like and subscribe because this showdown is just getting started. Malcolm shifted his weight, placing himself slightly in front of me, creating a physical barrier between my toxic siblings and my personal space. Jasmine rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed that we were not following her script. Are you deaf, Malcolm? She snapped, flipping her hair over her shoulder. Dad said it is time for you two to leave. Do not make this uglier than it already is. Malcolm ignored her completely. His silence infuriated her more than any insult ever could. He looked right past Jasmine and Dion, projecting his voice so it carried across the dining room, reaching my father on the stage. We are not going anywhere, Winston Malcolm stated. His tone was perfectly measured, lacking any of the hot anger my family usually thrived on. It was the calm, calculated voice of a corporate attorney who already knew he had won the case before the trial even began. My mother gasped, pressing a hand to her chest, visibly offended that Malcolm had dared to use my father's first name instead of addressing him with the absurd level of reverence he demanded from everyone. Malcolm continued gesturing toward the folder in my hands. Kendra brought you a retirement gift. She spent a considerable amount of time preparing it for you. We will gladly leave this venue, but not until you open it and read it in front of every single person you just tried to impress. The room grew incredibly tense. You could hear a pin drop on the carpeted floor. My father gripped the edges of the wooden podium, his knuckles turning a shade of pale gray. He was a man who ruled by intimidation, and he was entirely unequipped to handle someone like Malcolm, who could not be bullied, bought, or shamed. The standoff was no longer just about me being the family scapegoat. It was a public challenge to my father's authority. Dayon scoffed, crossing his arms and trying to look intimidating, but Malcolm's cold stare stopped him dead in his tracks. From the VIP tables, I saw my younger brother Trey pushing his chair back aggressively. The golden child was getting ready to defend his father's honor, unaware that they were all walking directly into a trap. Trey shoved his chair back so hard it scraped loudly against the polished floorboards. He marched over to where we stood, the heavy thud of his Italian leather shoes echoing in the quiet room. My brother was 30 years old, but he carried himself with the unearned swagger of a teenage bully who knew the principal would always let him off the hook. He stopped inches from Malcolm's face, invading his personal space, in a blatant attempt at physical intimidation. "Are you out of your mind, Malcolm?" Trey demanded, his voice dripping with venom. "You do not come into my father's party and start issuing ultimatums." Malcolm merely raised an eyebrow, remaining perfectly still. "I am simply asking a man to open his retirement gift tray. Is there a company policy against that?" Trey let out a harsh, mocking laugh that carried across the surrounding tables. Several guests turned to watch the spectacle, whispering behind their crystal champagne flutes. "Do not try to play smart with me," Trey snarled. "You think you are so clever because you wear a suit and carry a briefcase to some rundown public defender's office every day. You think that gives you the right to disrespect a man who built a $10 million logistics empire from scratch? Look around you, Malcolm. Look at the people in this room. You are completely out of your tax bracket." I stared at my brother, feeling a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. Trey had never worked a hard day in his entire life. While I was pulling all-nighters studying for my accounting exams, Trey was crashing luxury cars my father had bought him. When I was building my client list, Trey was failing out of basic business classes and relying on my father's deep pockets to bribe the university into letting him stay. Yet here he was, standing in a custom-tailored tuxedo, acting as though he had built the freight company with his own bare hands. "As of tomorrow morning, I am taking over as the chief executive officer of this entire operation," Trey announced loudly, making sure the wealthy investors at the front tables could hear him. "My father is passing the torch to me. We move millions of dollars of freight across the eastern seaboard every single week. We negotiate with massive national distributors. We handle real business. You fight over petty misdemeanors for a government salary. You have absolutely no authority here, so take my sister and get out before I make a phone call and have your law license reviewed for harassment." Malcolm did not blink. He did not step back. He simply tilted his head slightly, studying Trey with a look of mild amusement. I found it hilarious that my family had spent years looking down on Malcolm simply because he did not brag about his income. Because Malcolm was quiet, they assumed he was struggling. Because he did not drive a bright red sports car like Dion, they assumed he was at the bottom of the legal food chain. They had no idea that Malcolm was a senior corporate litigator who handled corporate mergers and hostile acquisitions worth more than my father's entire logistics company combined. "I am speaking to you," Trey barked, stepping even closer until their chests were almost touching. "Did you hear me? You are a low-paid public defender trying to flex in a room full of millionaires. It is embarrassing. Kendra is embarrassing. You both need to walk out those doors right now, or I will have the country club valet throw your cheap car off the property." From the stage, my father Winston watched the confrontation with a look of immense pride. He was thrilled to see his golden child stepping up to defend the family honor. My mother Brenda was practically glowing, her earlier panic replaced by a smug satisfaction. She truly believed her son was a powerful executive putting a lesser man in his place. It was a masterclass in mass delusion. Trey believed his own lies. He believed he was a successful businessman simply because his name was printed on a shiny gold vice president plaque on an office door. He had convinced himself that the company was thriving under his leadership, completely blind to the reality of his own sheer incompetence. Malcolm dealt with ruthless billionaire executives on a daily basis. He sat across the table from men who could ruin economies with a single signature. Watching Trey puff out his chest and throw around the phrase $10 million was like watching a toddler threaten a lion with a plastic sword. Malcolm adjusted his cuffs with slow, deliberate movements, deliberately ignoring Trey's hostile posturing. "You seem very confident for a man whose name is not actually on the deed to the company, Trey." Malcolm said, his voice low and dangerously calm. Trey flushed a deep shade of red, his jaw clenching tightly. "My name goes on the paperwork tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, he spat back. "And the first thing I am going to do is make sure Kendra is officially written out of any future dividends." Dad was right to cut her off. "She brings nothing to this family but resentment. You two are standing in a room built by winners, and you are nothing but a pair of bitter losers trying to ruin a celebration because you are broke." The arrogance radiating from him was suffocating. Trey truly believed that wealth was a measure of human worth, and because he had been handed a title, he assumed he was invincible. He thought the money in the company accounts belonged to him by divine right. He thought he could insult my husband, belittle my career, and command us like servants without facing a single consequence. He was completely unaware that the financial empire he was bragging about inheriting was nothing more than a hollow shell waiting to collapse. Trey leaned in closer to Malcolm, but I stepped between them. I was done letting my husband take the heat for a battle that belonged entirely to me. I looked up at my brother, meeting his furious gaze with absolute calm. Trey looked down at me with a twisted sneer. "You should be thanking Dad," he said, his voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear clearly. "Cutting you off financially when you turned 18 was the smartest business decision he ever made. You were a horrible investment, Kendra. You refused to study corporate management. You refused to fit into the company culture. You wanted to go play with numbers at some bottom-tier state school, so he cut the cord. It saved this family a fortune and kept our brand pure." I felt a cold smile form on my face. The absolute delusion was almost fascinating to witness in real time. I let my eyes slowly scan him from his expensive haircut down to his designer shoes, bought and paid for by the company accounts. "A bad investment," I repeated, my voice carrying clearly over the soft jazz music playing from the speakers. "Let us talk about investments, Trey, since you are the financial genius of the family. Let us talk about the return on investment Dad got from the two of us." My mother gasped from her seat at the table. "Kendra, stop it right now," she warned, her voice trembling with a rising panic. "You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing us in front of the mayor." I did not look at her. I kept my eyes locked on Trey. Dad refused to co-sign my student loans because I would not major in exactly what he wanted, I said, keeping my tone perfectly level and precise. "So I worked the night shift at a 24-hour diner. I paid for my own textbooks out of pocket. I graduated summa cum laude from that bottom-tier state school you love to mock, and I earned my certified public accountant license before I even turned 23. I built my own wealth from absolute scratch." I took a deliberate step forward, forcing Trey to step back slightly to maintain his balance. "And what was your return on investment, Trey? Dad spent over $500,000 on your tuition at a private university. He paid for your luxury apartment, your fraternity dues, and your spring break trips to Cabo. And what exactly did you give him in return for all that capital?" Trey opened his mouth to speak, but I did not let him get a single syllable out. "You failed out of your finance program twice," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air of the ballroom like a scalpel. "You spent 5 years getting a generic communications degree that you barely passed. And the only thing you actually earned during your entire college career was a suspended driver's license from crashing your Porsche into a retaining wall while intoxicated." Dad had to pay a highly priced defense lawyer another $50,000 just to keep your criminal record clean. Shut up! Kendra Trey hissed, his face turning from red to a dangerous shade of purple. You do not know what you are talking about. I run the logistics division. I manage 50 employees. You manage absolutely nothing, I shot back immediately, not giving him an inch of breathing room. You hold a fake vice president title because Dad created a position out of thin air just to give you an office with a corner window. You show up at 11 in the morning, take a 3-hour lunch, and spend the rest of the afternoon playing golf on the company dime. Your own warehouse managers do not even report to you because they know you cannot read a basic freight manifest. You are a mascot tray. You are not an executive. The guests at the nearby tables were no longer pretending to ignore us. They were dead silent, hanging on to every single word. The pristine illusion of the perfect, wealthy Atlanta family was cracking wide open for all of high society to see. Jasmine slammed her hand flat on the table, causing the crystal glassware to rattle dangerously. You are just jealous, she yelled, her voice shrill and desperate as she rushed to defend her favorite sibling. You are just bitter because Dad chose him over you. You have always been insanely jealous of Trey because he is the heir, and you are just a glorified bookkeeper. A glorified bookkeeper, I repeated, turning my attention slowly to my sister. Is that what you genuinely think I do, Jasmine? Do you honestly believe I am sitting in a beige cubicle somewhere sorting through receipts for minimum wage? Jasmine crossed her arms, looking away dismissively. We all know you are struggling, she scoffed, adjusting her diamond necklace. You show up here in a cheap dress trying to cause a scene because you want a handout. Dad is not going to write you a check, Kendra, so just give up and go home to your little apartment. The staggering ignorance of my family was breathtaking. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and obsession with status that they never once bothered to look into what I actually did for a living. They never bothered to check the name of the firm I worked for or the high-profile clients I represented. They simply assumed that, because I did not flaunt designer labels on social media and lease cars, I could not afford, I must be living in crushing poverty. Malcolm chuckled softly beside me. It was a cold, dark sound that made Dion physically flinch. You people really have no idea who you are talking to, Malcolm said, shaking his head in pure disbelief. You have spent your entire lives looking down on Kendra while she quietly lapped you in every conceivable way. Trey clenched his fist, taking a step toward Malcolm again, his ego bruised beyond repair. I am not going to let some low-level public defender come into my country club and insult my family, he growled, his chest heaving. I am calling security right now. You two are entirely done. Before Trey could even reach into his tuxedo pocket for his phone, my mother beat him to it. She had been waving frantically at the banquet manager for the past 2 minutes, her perfectly manicured facade completely crumbling under the weight of the public spectacle we were causing. Mr. Harrison, the banquet manager, hurried over to our table, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. My mother grabbed his arm, her acrylic nails digging into his suit jacket. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, her eyes wide with a perfectly manufactured look of terror. These people are trespassing, Brenda declared, her voice shaking with dramatic flair. They were not invited to this private event, and they are becoming verbally aggressive. My husband is retiring tonight, and we have highly respected politicians and corporate investors in this room. We cannot have these violent instigators threatening our safety. I want them removed from the property immediately. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, completely, entirely stunned by her capacity for manipulation. She was standing there in her expensive gown, lying straight to the face of the country club manager, painting her own daughter as a violent criminal just to save face in front of her country club friends. She was willing to have me physically dragged out of a building rather than face the uncomfortable truth of her own toxic family dynamic. Mr. Harrison looked between my mother and me, clearly distressed by the situation. He nodded quickly to Brenda and reached up to the radio piece clipped to his lapel. We have a code 3 in the main ballroom, he whispered into the microphone. Send the detail immediately. We have hostile trespassers refusing to leave. A heavy, suffocating tension settled over the room. The soft jazz music playing in the background seemed to fade away completely, leaving only the sound of clinking ice and nervous whispers from the surrounding tables. 200 of Atlanta's most elite citizens sat in absolute silence, waiting to watch the dramatic downfall of Winston's least favorite child. Up on the stage, my father stood behind the podium, his chest puffed out, his hands resting casually on the wood. He was not going to intervene. He was not going to stop his wife from calling security on his daughter. In fact, he looked incredibly satisfied. He loved this display of absolute power. He loved knowing that he could simply snap his fingers and have me erased from his perfect picture. He offered me a slow, mocking smile, a silent confirmation that he had won. Jasmine leaned closer to Dion, crossing her arms with a smug look of victory. "Well, this is going to be incredibly embarrassing for you, Kendra," she said loudly. "I told you to leave quietly, but you just had to push it. Now you are going to be paraded out of here like common criminals. I hope you parked your little economy car far away, because the valet is going to laugh right in your face." Trey stood off to the side, adjusting his tie, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He honestly believed he had intimidated us. He thought his empty threats and his fake vice president title were the reasons we were about to be ejected. Within 30 seconds, the heavy double doors at the back of the banquet hall swung open. 3 large security guards dressed in crisp, dark uniforms marched into the room. Their heavy boots thudded against the hardwood flooring, a sound that echoed through the silent ballroom like a countdown to our humiliation. The guests parted like the Red Sea, giving the guards a clear path directly to table 24. My heart began to race, beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Even though I knew exactly what was in the manila envelope I was holding, the primal fear of being publicly manhandled and thrown out into the street by armed men was deeply unsettling. The sheer hostility of my family, the coldness of my father's, the venom in my mother's voice, it was all crashing down on me at once. This was the definitive end. Any lingering hope I had that my parents might one day love me or respect me died right there on the country club floor. The head security guard, a tall, muscular man with a stern expression, stopped right in front of Malcolm. He placed his hand resting on his utility belt, looking us up and down with absolute authority. "Sir Mom," he said, his voice deep and uncompromising. "The hosts of this private event have asked you to leave. You are currently trespassing on Oak Ridge property. I am going to have to ask you to turn around and walk toward the exit right now. If you resist or cause any further disturbance, we will involve the local police department." My mother let out a loud, exaggerated sigh of relief. "Thank goodness," she muttered, placing a hand over her heart. "Please get them out of here, officer. They are ruining a $10,000 dinner." The guests began to murmur again, some shaking their heads in disapproval, some openly glaring at Malcolm and me. I felt the weight of 200 judgments pressing down on my shoulders. In their eyes, I was exactly what my family claimed I was. A bitter, poor, resentful daughter who had crashed a beautiful celebration just to throw a tantrum. I looked up at Malcolm. I expected to see a flicker of concern, or perhaps a signal that it was time to deploy our strategy. But Malcolm was an immovable object. He did not look at the security guards. He did not look at my mother. He kept his eyes locked firmly on Trey, who was still smirking from the sidelines. Malcolm slowly reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. The head security guard immediately tensed up, stepping forward and raising a hand to stop him. "Sir, keep your hands where I can see them," the guard warned, his tone dropping an octave. But Malcolm simply produced a sleek black leather wallet. He flipped it open with a calm, deliberate motion, pulling out a single piece of dark plastic. It was an obsidian black corporate credit card. He held it between his fingers, the silver numbers catching the light from the chandeliers overhead. The trap was officially set, and my family had just walked straight into the jaws of it. Malcolm held the heavy metal card between his index and middle finger, perfectly steady. The head security guard frowned, his hand still resting cautiously on his utility belt. He looked from the card to Malcolm's face, clearly unsure of what was happening. This was not the reaction he usually got from trespassers. Mr. Harrison, Malcolm said, his voice slicing through the thick silence of the ballroom. He did not look at the guard. He looked directly at the banquet manager, who was still sweating nervously next to my mother. Before your men lay a single finger on my wife or attempt to escort us off this property, I highly suggest you pull out your tablet and open the final billing manifest for tonight's event. My mother let out an exasperated sigh, throwing her hands up in the air. This is ridiculous, she announced to the crowd. They are stalling. Mr. Harrison, please do your job and remove them. We are trying to celebrate a lifetime of corporate achievement here. Trey chuckled loudly, taking a step forward and crossing his arms. A credit card, really? Malcolm, he mocked, his voice dripping with condescension. What are you going to do? Buy us a round of drinks on your little public defender salary to apologize? Put the plastic away, man. It is embarrassing. You are way out of your league here. Malcolm did not even acknowledge Trey's existence. He kept his piercing gaze locked on the manager, the final manifest, Mr. Harrison. He repeated, his tone dropping into a terrifyingly polite register. Open it right now and read the name on the primary billing account. If you fail to do so, and your guards touch my wife, I will personally ensure this country club is buried in so many civil rights and corporate liability lawsuits that you will be auctioning off these crystal chandeliers to pay your legal fees. The banquet manager swallowed hard. He was a man who survived in the hospitality industry by reading the room, and right now his instincts were screaming that Malcolm was not bluffing. With trembling hands, Mr. Harrison reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his digital tablet. He tapped the screen rapidly, his eyes scanning the data for the Oak Ridge Country Club retirement gala. Jasmine rolled her eyes, leaning against Dion. I cannot believe we have to stand here and watch this pathetic performance, she complained loudly. Just let them throw you out, Kendra. Have a shred of dignity for once in your life. I stood in silence, watching the exact moment the color completely drained from Mr. Harrison's face. He stared at his tablet screen, his mouth falling slightly open. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to force the letters on the screen to change, but they remained exactly the same. He looked up at Malcolm, then down at the black corporate card in his hand, and then over to my father, who was still standing at the podium. Call them off, Mr. Harrison, Malcolm instructed softly. The manager scrambled forward, waving his hands frantically at the 3 large security guards. Stand down, he ordered, his voice cracking slightly. Officers, please step back. Stand down right now. The head guard looked confused, but he immediately dropped his hand from his belt and took 2 steps back, giving us a wide berth. My mother stared at the manager in absolute disbelief. What are you doing? Brenda demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. I told you to remove them. They are ruining the aesthetic of my party. Mr. Harrison took a deep breath, looking terrified, as he turned to face my mother. I cannot do that, ma'am, he stammered, wiping his forehead with a cloth handkerchief. I absolutely cannot ask them to leave. And why the hell not? Trey barked, stepping aggressively toward the manager. My father rented this entire ballroom for the night. We are the hosts. We want them gone. Malcolm finally smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory smile. Your father did not rent this room, Trey, Malcolm said, turning to face my brother. Your father tried to rent this room. But 3 days ago, when the country club attempted to process the final payment for this $50,000 event, Winston's platinum credit cards mysteriously declined. The word declined echoed through the silent banquet hall like a gunshot. 200 wealthy guests gasped in unison. My father's jaw dropped, his eyes widening in sheer horror. In the elite circles of Atlanta high society, a declined credit card was a fate worse than death. It was the ultimate mark of failure. That is a lie, my father boomed into the microphone, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and panic. It was a simple banking error. My accounts are perfectly fine. It was not a banking error, Winston, Malcolm corrected, projecting his voice so every single person in the room could hear the truth. Mr. Harrison was going to cancel the catering, pull the staff, and lock the doors on this entire masquerade. The only reason this party is happening tonight, the only reason you are eating prime rib and drinking expensive champagne is because Kendra stepped in. I watched my mother stumble backward slightly as if she had been physically struck. Her eyes darted from me to Malcolm and then to the manager, hoping someone would tell her it was a joke. Mr. Harrison read the name on the account Malcolm commanded. The manager cleared his throat, looking down at his tablet. The $50,000 invoice was paid in full on Wednesday morning by Vanguard Forensic Financials. He announced, his voice trembling. The authorized signer on the corporate account is Kendra. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt heavy. The guards looked at each other and quietly backed away toward the kitchen doors, realizing they had just tried to throw out the person who bought the building for the night. Malcolm slipped the black card back into his wallet and slid it into his jacket pocket. He looked at my mother, who was now gripping the edge of the table for support. "So you see," Brenda, Malcolm said, his voice dripping with cold satisfaction. "You cannot kick us out of this room for trespassing because, legally speaking, we own the room tonight. We paid for the chandeliers. We paid for the security guards you just tried to weaponize. We even paid for the microphone Winston is currently sweating all over." Jasmine stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Dion looked physically sick, shifting his weight nervously from side to side. Trey looked completely lost, staring at me as if I had just grown a second head. "You think you are so smart?" Trey finally stammered, trying to salvage his shattered ego. "You think paying for a party makes you a big shot? Dad probably just had a fraud alert on his account because he travels so much. He will write you a check for the 50 grand tomorrow morning and you can go back to your miserable life." I finally stepped forward, brushing past Malcolm to stand directly in front of my brother. I looked him dead in the eyes, letting 35 years of suppressed anger rise to the surface. It was time to pull the curtain back completely. "He is not going to write me a check tomorrow, Trey," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "He is not going to write anyone a check ever again." My father gripped the wooden podium so hard I thought the wood might snap. "Kendra," he warned, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Do not say another word." I ignored him entirely, keeping my focus on the golden child who was about to lose his entire world. He did not have a fraud alert on his card. "Trey," I continued, watching the confusion spread across my brother's face. "I know exactly why his payment bounced. And before this night is over, you are all going to know too." The whispers started immediately. At first, it was just a low hum of confusion from the tables closest to us, but within seconds, it spread across the entire ballroom like a wildfire. In the circles of Atlanta, elite, nothing travels faster than the scent of financial ruin. I watched as men in tailored tuxedos leaned into their wives, whispering frantically. I saw wealthy investors, the same people who had been clapping for my father just 10 minutes ago, suddenly look at him with deep suspicion. Winston realized he was losing control of the narrative. He gripped the microphone so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He forced a booming laugh that sounded entirely hollow, echoing awkwardly through the silent room. "This is absolutely outrageous," my father declared, forcing a patronizing smile as he looked out at the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse my estranged daughter's dramatic imagination. She has always had a flair for the theatrical. There is no financial mystery here. It is a simple security hold on my platinum card because I recently made some massive international transfers for our upcoming corporate merger. The bank flagged it out of an abundance of caution. I will be having a very long and unpleasant conversation with the regional manager of my bank tomorrow morning." He pointed a thick finger at Mr. Harrison, who was still cowering near our table. "And I will be filing a massive defamation lawsuit against the Oak Ridge Country Club for allowing this private information to be weaponized against me at my own retirement party. You will be hearing from my legal team first thing Monday morning, Mr. Harrison." My mother immediately nodded along, eagerly latching onto the lie. She turned to the neighboring tables, forcing a bright plastic smile. "Yes, it is just a security measure," she assured the guests, her voice pitching up an octave in panic. "You know how these banks are nowadays. Too much money moving around sets off their little alarms. Everything is perfectly fine. They were so desperate to maintain the illusion. They were willing to lie to the faces of city councilmen and major corporate shareholders just to keep the facade glued together for one more hour. But I was done letting them dictate the reality of this family. I did not need a microphone to command the room. I took another step forward, leaving the shadows of the back tables entirely. The guests near the aisle instinctively pulled their chairs in, giving me a clear, unobstructed path to the stage. "It was not a security hold, Winston," I said, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. I dropped the title of Dad completely. He had not been a father to me in decades, so I addressed him like the fraud he was. "It was not a banking error, and no regional manager is going to apologize to you tomorrow morning because your bank did not authorize the hold." Winston glared down at me from the podium, the fake smile instantly melting off his face. "Shut your mouth, Kendra," he hissed, forgetting the microphone was still picking up his voice. "You are making a fool of yourself. Your corporate and personal accounts have been frozen by the feds since Tuesday," I said, delivering the words with the cold precision of a judge handing down a sentence. The word feds dropped into the center of the ballroom like a live grenade. The physical reaction from the crowd was immediate. 200 people sat up straight. Several guests actually gasped aloud. In the world of high finance and corporate logistics, you can survive a bad quarter or a failed merger, but nobody survives the federal government. To these people, associating with someone under federal investigation was a toxic contagion. I watched two men sitting at the front table quietly put their napkins down and begin inching their chairs backward, preparing to slip out the side doors. "That is a complete fabrication," my father roared, hitting the wooden podium with his fist. "You are clinically insane. You are standing in front of my peers making up malicious lies because you are bitter that I did not put you in the succession plan." I held up the manila envelope, keeping my eyes locked on his. Tuesday morning at 8:15 Eastern Standard Time, the Federal Financial Crimes Division placed an absolute freeze on every single asset tied to your Social Security number and the company tax identification number, I explained, detailing the facts with surgical accuracy. "Your primary checking accounts, your offshore savings accounts in the Caymans, your investment portfolios, they are all locked down. The government has seized control of your financial existence, Winston." "Lies," Trey shouted from the side of the room, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You do not know anything about his accounts. You do not have access to that information. You are just guessing." I turned slightly to look at my brother. "Check your phone, Trey," I suggested calmly. "Open your banking application right now. Check the corporate expense account you love to use for your bottle service at the nightclubs." Trey froze. He looked at me, his confidence wavering for the very first time tonight. He slowly reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out his smartphone. His fingers moved frantically across the glowing screen, tapping into his mobile banking app. Jasmine, who had been standing next to Dion with a look of pure disgust, suddenly grew very pale. She grabbed her own diamond-encrusted phone from her designer clutch and began swiping aggressively. "Check your trust fund, Jasmine," I told her, not raising my voice but making sure she heard every word. "The trust fund you use to pay for your weekly spa treatments and your custom gowns. Look at the available balance." For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the room was the heavy breathing of my family and the soft jazz music that was completely oblivious to the destruction happening. Then Jasmine let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Her phone slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor. "It is 0, she whispered, staring at the glowing screen on the ground. "Dion, the account says 0. It says contact branch administrator. Everything is gone." Trey was staring at his screen, his mouth hanging open. "The corporate accounts are locked," he muttered, his voice completely stripped of its usual arrogance. "It says the assets are frozen pending external review." My mother let out a shrill cry, rushing over to Trey and grabbing his arm. "What do you mean, frozen?" she demanded, shaking him. "Show me the screen, Trey. Show me the money is still there. We have a mortgage payment on the lake house next week." "The money is not there, Brenda," I told her. watching the reality of their situation finally crash down on them. You cannot pay the mortgage on the lake house. You cannot pay the lease on Dion's luxury cars. You cannot even pay the valet outside to bring your vehicles around tonight. You are completely and utterly broke. Winston gripped the microphone, staring at me with a mixture of pure hatred and sheer terror. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had completely snapped shut. "How do you know this?" he demanded, his voice dropping into a raspy whisper that the microphone broadcasted to the entire silent room. "How could you possibly know about a federal hold before my own legal team?" I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had worn all evening. "Because, Winston, I did not just discover the freeze. I am the reason it happened." The elite guests were no longer just whispering. They were openly staring at me, realizing that the quiet scapegoat daughter in the cheap off-the-rack dress was actually the one holding the executioner's axe. I watched my father's empire, the one he had built on a foundation of lies and favoritism, begin to crumble right before my eyes. And we were not even finished yet. Jasmine gripped Dion's arm so tightly, her knuckles turned completely white. She shook him slightly, her perfect manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. "Do something, Dion," she pleaded, her voice cracking with a high-pitched shrillness that echoed across the silent ballroom. "Tell them they are lying. Tell them your accounts are fine. We do not need my father's money anyway. You have your own empire. We are entirely independent. Tell them about the Buckhead deal you just closed." Dion did not speak. He did not puff out his chest or adjust his designer watch the way he had just 10 minutes ago. Instead, he was staring blankly at the floor, taking shallow, rapid breaths. A thick bead of sweat rolled down his temple, disappearing into the stiff white collar of his custom-tailored shirt. His hands were trembling so violently, he had to stuff them into his trouser pockets to hide the shaking. He looked exactly like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, waiting for the executioner to pull the lever. "Go ahead, Dion," I urged, my voice dripping with cold, false encouragement. "Tell your wife all about your sprawling real estate empire. Tell her about the massive commercial complex you supposedly bought in Buckhead last month. Explain to the mayor and the city councilman sitting in the front row exactly how you generate your incredible wealth." Dion finally looked up, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit. "Shut up, Kendra," he snapped, his voice barely a hoarse whisper. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. My business is entirely separate from this family. You cannot touch me. Keep my name out of your mouth." "That is a fascinating theory, Dion," I replied, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to him. "But as a forensic accountant, my entire professional existence revolves around proving theories wrong. I do not look at the luxury cars you lease or the expensive suits you wear to country club dinners. I look at the paper. And the paper trail you left behind is so incredibly sloppy, it is frankly an insult to my profession." "What is she talking about?" Jasmine asked, looking frantically between me and her husband. "Dayon, tell her she is crazy. You just showed me the blueprints for the new shopping plaza yesterday." "He bought those blueprints off the internet for $50, Jasmine," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Dayon's terrified face. "He is not a real estate developer. He is a parasite. Let us talk about your primary holding company, Dion. Horizon Development Group. That is the name printed in gold foil on your fancy business cards, right? The company that supposedly develops luxury retail spaces across the eastern seaboard. I pulled the corporate filings for Horizon Development last month during my audit." I paused, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second to build the tension. The entire room of elite guests was hanging on to my every word, completely captivated by the destruction of a man who had spent years bragging about his fake riches. "Horizon Development is a limited liability company registered to a virtual mailbox in Delaware," I announced, projecting my voice clearly. "You have 0 employees. You own 0 physical assets. You do not hold a single deed to any land. You do not even possess an active commercial real estate license in the state of Georgia. Horizon Development is nothing but a dummy shell company. and it has only ever had one single client in its entire existence. I turned slowly to look at my father, who was now clutching his chest, his breathing ragged and uneven. He looked as though the floor was opening up beneath him. "Did you really think no one would notice, Winston?" I asked him, the cold reality of my words acting like a physical blow. "Over the past 4 years, your logistics company has paid Horizon Development over $2 million in consulting fees and land acquisition retainers. Except Dion never acquired any land. He never consulted on any warehouse locations. He simply generated fake invoices for fictitious zoning surveys and non-existent structural appraisals. And you authorized every single payment to keep him flush with cash so Jasmine could continue living like royalty without you having to dip into your personal savings." Winston opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. He knew he was caught. He had used his own company accounts to funnel money to his son-in-law, a blatant misuse of corporate funds that defrauded his investors. But here is the truly tragic part, Winston. I continued, raising my voice slightly so the VIP guests could hear every single detail of the betrayal. "I know you approved a monthly allowance of $20,000 to Dion's shell company. You thought you were cleverly hiding money from the tax board to spoil your favorite daughter. But you severely underestimated how greedy and desperate your son-in-law truly is." Malcolm stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. He unlatched his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of printed bank statements and wire transfer logs. He slammed them down onto the crisp white tablecloth of table 24. The loud smack echoed through the quiet room, causing several guests to jump in their seats. "Without your permission, Dion began forging your signature on secondary invoices," Malcolm explained, his voice booming with the dark, unyielding authority of a seasoned corporate litigator. "He bumped his own payments from $20,000 a month to $80,000 a month. He was siphoning cash directly out of your operating budget to cover his own massive offshore sports gambling debts and his luxury car leases. He stole an additional $1.5 million right under your nose, Winston." Jasmine let go of Dion's arm as if his skin had suddenly caught fire. She took a massive step backward, stumbling slightly in her expensive heels, staring at him in sheer absolute horror. "You stole from my father!" she shrieked, her pristine high society image completely shattering in an instant. "You told me you were making millions in commercial property. You told me you were a mogul. You bought me diamond necklaces with money you stole from my own family." Dion held his hands up defensively, shooting a desperate, pleading look at Winston. "It was just a short-term loan, Winston," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "I was going to pay it back. I swear to you I was going to pay it back. I just needed some liquidity for a private investment opportunity that fell through. I was going to replace every single dime before the end of the fiscal year." Winston lunged forward from the stage, his face a mask of pure murderous rage. "You filthy thief!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Dion, his voice cracking with fury. "I gave you everything. I let you marry my oldest daughter. I gave you a fake vendor contract to save your pathetic pride, and you robbed me blind in return. I will absolutely destroy you. I will see you rot in a prison cell." "You are both thieves," I interrupted, bringing the focus entirely back to the cold, hard facts. My voice sliced through my father's rage, shutting him down instantly. "The only difference is that Dion was stealing from you while you were stealing from the federal government, Winston." The federal auditors noticed the bleeding operating budget. They saw the massive unexplained wire transfers going to a Delaware shell company, and they flagged it as money laundering. I looked at Dion, who was now openly weeping, his hands covering his face in shame. Dion's little embezzlement scheme is the exact reason the Financial Crimes Division initiated the audit in the first place, I revealed, delivering the final crushing blow. His greed triggered the investigation that just brought down your entire logistics empire. You let a parasite into your home, Winston, and he ate you alive from the inside out." Jasmine covered her face with her hands, letting out a loud, ugly sob that echoed miserably across the banquet hall. Her entire identity was built on being a wealthy, superior socialite who looked down on everyone else, especially me. In the span of 5 minutes, she had learned her trust fund was empty. Her husband was a complete fraud, and she was married to a man facing severe federal prison time. The golden child was finally experiencing the real world, and it was tearing her to shreds. Jasmine continued to sob, her face buried in her hands, but my father was no longer paying any attention to her. For a man like Winston, family was only useful when it elevated his public image. The moment Jasmine and Dion became liabilities, he discarded them completely. He turned his back on his oldest daughter, leaving her weeping in the middle of the ballroom, and marched back to the center of the stage. He grabbed the microphone from the wooden podium, ripping it from its stand with a sharp, aggressive motion. The loud screech of audio feedback pierced the air, causing several guests to cover their ears. But Winston did not flinch. He stood tall, adjusting his tailored tuxedo jacket, and forced his facial features into an expression of calm, authoritative control. It was the same look he used during intense board meetings when he was cornered by investors. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Ladies and gentlemen, Winston began, his deep voice echoing across the silent room. I must sincerely apologize for this incredibly tasteless display. What you are witnessing right now is the unfortunate result of unchecked mental illness and deep-seated jealousy. I stood perfectly still watching him spin his web. Even with the federal documents sitting in the envelope in my hands, he was going to try and gaslight 200 people into believing I was the villain. My estranged daughter Kendra has always harbored a bitter resentment toward this family. He continued, pacing slowly across the stage. She has spent her entire adult life feeling inadequate because she simply does not possess the business acumen or the drive to succeed at the level her brother and sister have achieved. And tonight, rather than celebrate my legacy, she has decided to fabricate a ridiculous, sensationalized story to ruin my retirement. He pointed a steady finger at Dayon, who was still staring at the floor in a state of sheer panic. My son-in-law may have made some poor personal investments, and if he has misused any funds, I assure you my legal team will handle him privately. But do not let this hysterical woman convince you for 1 second that my logistics empire is in any kind of financial jeopardy. My mother, who had been gripping the edge of the table for dear life, suddenly let out a massive breath. She desperately wanted to believe him. She immediately stood up straighter, smoothing out the expensive fabric of her gown. She looked around at the guests, nodding her head vigorously. He is exactly right, Brenda chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Kendra has been under psychiatric care before. She is making all of this up because Winston refused to put her in the corporate succession plan. Please, everyone, just ignore her outburst. I had never been under psychiatric care a day in my life, but my parents were perfectly willing to brand me as mentally unstable if it protected their wealth and status. It was a disgusting tactic, but to my absolute horror, it was starting to work on the crowd. I could see the wealthy guests exchanging uncertain glances. A few of the city councilmen who had been inching toward the exits slowly settled back into their chairs. Winston was a charismatic titan of industry, and they were far more comfortable believing his lies than accepting the ugly truth. Seeing the crowd waver, my father doubled down. He took a deep breath, puffing his chest out with supreme arrogance. Let me tell you the real reason my accounts are currently restricted, Winston announced, his voice booming with triumphant confidence. And let me tell you why Kendra chose tonight of all nights to throw this pathetic temper tantrum. She knows that tomorrow morning, I am not just passing the title of Chief Executive Officer to my son Trey. Tomorrow morning, my company is finalizing a $75 million merger with National Apex Freight. The entire ballroom erupted in loud, shocked murmurs. National Apex Freight was one of the largest shipping conglomerates in the country. A merger of that size was monumental. It was the kind of business deal that would solidify Winston's legacy permanently and elevate our family into the highest echelon of American wealth. That is right, Winston smiled, soaking in the awestruck reactions of his peers. We are being acquired in a historic buyout. And when a merger of this magnitude occurs, the Securities and Exchange Commission requires a standard escrow lockdown on all primary corporate and executive accounts to verify asset valuation. There is no federal criminal audit. There is only a routine compliance freeze. By Monday morning, the hold will be lifted, the ink will be dry, and my family will be wealthier than anyone in this room could possibly imagine. The guests actually began to applaud. It started with one or two investors at the front tables and quickly spread through the room. They were clapping for him. They were buying the illusion completely hook, line, and sinker. My father stood on the stage basking in their admiration, looking down at me with a triumphant, mocking sneer. He truly believed he had outsmarted me. Trey suddenly burst into loud, arrogant laughter. He stepped away from my mother and walked right back up to Malcolm and me, his chest puffed out so far he looked ridiculous. Did you hear that? Kendra Trey mocked, clapping his hands slowly. $75 million. And you thought you were doing something with your little forensic accounting job. You thought you could come in here and scare us with some fake paperwork. We are cashing out. I am going to be the vice president of a national division, and you are going to go back to your miserable little apartment with nothing. Trey turned to the crowd, waving his hands to encourage the applause. He was completely rejuvenated. The golden child was back on his throne, riding the coattails of his father's massive lie. He looked at Malcolm with utter disgust. And you, Trey sneered, pointing at my husband. You can take your little black corporate card and shove it. My dad is about to have $75 million in liquid capital. We can buy this entire country club and bulldoze it just for fun. You two are completely irrelevant. Security is going to drag you out of here, and by tomorrow you will be permanently cut out of the family trust. My mother walked over and linked her arm through Trey's, smiling proudly at the room. Winston is a visionary, she announced loudly. He has secured our future for generations to come. I am so sorry you all had to witness the jealous ravings of a disgruntled child. I stood in the center of the chaos, listening to the applause and watching my family celebrate a victory that did not actually exist. The sheer audacity of my father's lie was breathtaking. He had woven a masterpiece of corporate jargon using words like escrow lockdown and asset valuation to blind his uneducated country club friends. He had thrown his own son-in-law under the bus, labeled his daughter as mentally unstable, and invented a $75 million buyout, all in the span of 3 minutes. It was the performance of a lifetime. And for a brief, fleeting moment, Winston actually looked like the untouchable titan of industry he always pretended to be. But I did not feel defeated. I did not feel the familiar sting of rejection or the urge to cry. Instead, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace, because I knew something that Winston did not know. I knew that the higher he climbed up his mountain of lies, the more devastating his fall was going to be. I turned my head slightly and looked up at Malcolm. My husband had remained perfectly silent during my father's entire bombastic speech. He had let Winston dig the hole as deep as humanly possible. Malcolm caught my eye and gave me a single slow nod. The trap had been baited and Winston had swallowed it whole. It was time for the corporate litigator to take the floor. Malcolm took a slow, deliberate step forward, unbuttoning his tailored suit jacket with a calm precision that instantly commanded attention. He did not rush. He did not shout. He possessed the quiet, terrifying energy of a predator who had successfully backed its prey into a corner with absolutely no way out. He walked right past Trey, treating my brother like an invisible piece of furniture, and stopped at the foot of the stage, looking directly up at my father. Winston is actually telling you the truth about one very specific detail, Malcolm announced. He did not need a microphone. His voice was trained for federal courtrooms and high-stakes arbitration tables. It carried a dark, resonant authority that effortlessly sliced through the remaining murmurs in the ballroom. National Apex Freight is indeed absorbing his logistics company tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. For a fraction of a second, a look of smug validation flashed across Winston's face. He gripped the podium, standing a little taller, believing that Malcolm was somehow conceding defeat. Trey let out another arrogant bark of laughter, crossing his arms and looking around at the guests as if to say, "I told you so." My mother actually clapped her hands together, a short, sharp sound of triumph, but their celebration lasted exactly 3 seconds. "However, Winston is fundamentally lying to you about the nature of this transaction," Malcolm continued, his tone dropping to a glacial chill. "Because tomorrow morning is not a merger. National Apex Freight does not merge with failing regional companies. It consumes them. What is happening tomorrow at 9 o'clock is a hostile liquidation." The smug smile on Winston's face completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but Malcolm raised a single hand, a gesture of absolute authority that somehow silenced a man who was used to interrupting everyone. "There is no $75 million payout waiting for you tomorrow, Winston," Malcolm said methodically, dismantling my father's grand illusion piece by piece. "There is no golden parachute, there is no massive wealth transfer. National Apex is buying your entire operation for pennies on the dollar. They are purchasing your trucks, your warehouse leases, and your client lists entirely for scrap. Because your logistics empire is not a functioning business anymore. It is a financial sinkhole." The guests in the front row were leaning forward in their chairs, completely captivated by the brutal execution taking place. The wealthy investors who had just applauded Winston were now staring at him with expressions of profound disgust. "You lied to your board of directors." Malcolm projected his voice, filling every corner of the room. "You lied to your private investors sitting right here in this room. You have spent the last 4 years operating at a catastrophic loss. Between Dion's embezzlement, your own reckless offshore investments, and the massive operational failures on the warehouse floor, your company is currently drowning in $8 million of hidden toxic debt." Trey rushed forward, his face turning pale. "That is impossible," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Malcolm. "I look at the revenue reports every single week. We are highly profitable. We have millions in liquid capital. You are making this up because you are a broke public defender trying to ruin my future." Malcolm finally turned his gaze to my brother. "You look at the revenue reports Winston wants you to see?" "Trey." Malcolm corrected, his voice dripping with absolute pity. "You look at the fake ledgers he manufactured to keep you complacent so you would stop asking questions and keep playing golf. If you actually knew how to read a real balance sheet, you would have realized your company has not turned a legitimate profit since you dropped out of college." Trey stumbled backward, bumping into my mother, who was now clutching her pearl necklace as if it was a life preserver. She was hyperventilating, her eyes darting frantically around the room, realizing that her entire high society identity was rapidly burning to the ground. To cover that $8 million deficit, Winston illegally leveraged the employee pension fund, Malcolm revealed, delivering a strike that made several guests physically gasp. He mortgaged the commercial insurance policies. He drained every single reserve account, trying to keep the lights on, and the luxury car leases paid. He was running a corporate Ponzi scheme right under the nose of the federal government. And when National Apex Freight discovered the extent of the rot, they did not offer a merger. They offered an ultimatum. Winston leaned heavily against the wooden podium, looking as though all the blood had been drained from his body. He was trembling visibly. The titan of industry. The man who had spent 35 years making me feel completely worthless was suddenly reduced to a weak, terrified old man, exposed in front of the very people he worshipped. "You sign over the company entirely, surrendering all equity and all executive control, or they hand the fraudulent financial records directly to the Department of Justice." Malcolm stated the cold reality of his words, hammering into the silent room. "That is the deal you signed on Wednesday, Winston. You sold your entire legacy just to keep yourself out of a federal penitentiary for one more week." Trey grabbed his own hair, tugging at it in a frantic panic. "But I am the chief executive officer," he cried out, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "Dad told me I am taking over the company tomorrow. He promised me the title. I have an office. I have a staff. You do not have a staff," Trey Malcolm replied, completely unfazed by my brother's meltdown. "Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, A corporate restructuring team is going to walk into that building and terminate the entire executive board. Your office is already being packed into cardboard boxes. You are not a vice president, and you are certainly not a chief executive officer. You are unemployed. Jasmine, who was still weeping near table 24, let out a loud wail, sinking slowly to the floor. Her trust fund was gone. Her husband's money was fake. And now the family company, the ultimate source of her unearned superiority, was completely destroyed. "Who are you?" Winston suddenly rasped, his voice barely audible over the sound of my mother's panicked, hyperventilating. He stared down at Malcolm with wild, bloodshot eyes. "How do you have access to the acquisition terms? Those documents are secured under a strict non-disclosure agreement. Only the National Apex legal team has access to those files." Malcolm reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy embossed business card. He walked up the short steps to the stage, approached the podium, and slapped the card down on the wood right in front of Winston's trembling hands. My family had spent years insulting Malcolm. They had mocked his modest vehicle, his lack of flashy jewelry, and his refusal to brag about his income. They had labeled him a low-paid public defender because that narrative fit perfectly into their twisted view of the world. They desperately needed me to be a failure, so they assumed my husband must be a failure too. "Allow me to formally introduce myself," Winston Malcolm said, his voice echoing with devastating finality. "I am not a public defender. I am a senior partner at Vanguard Legal, and for the past 6 months I have been the lead corporate counsel representing National Apex Freight." The absolute shock that rippled through the ballroom was palpable. 200 guests sat in stunned silence, absorbing the magnitude of the reveal. "I am the man who audited your fake ledgers," Malcolm continued, leaning in close to my father so there was no mistaking the power dynamic. "I am the man who discovered your $8 million in hidden debt. I am the man who drafted the hostile acquisition contract you were forced to sign on Wednesday. I am the one stripping your company for parts." Winston let out a choked, agonizing sound. He stumbled back from the podium, clutching his chest. He looked from the business card to Malcolm, and then across the room to me. The realization was destroying his mind. The very people he had just publicly humiliated, the daughter he had ordered out of the room, and the son-in-law he had endlessly mocked, were the architects of his total annihilation. "We did not come here tonight to ask for a handout," Winston Malcolm said, turning his back on my father and walking down the steps to stand proudly beside me. "We came here tonight to watch you celebrate an empire that I already bought and paid for." Malcolm turned away from my father, leaving Winston speechless and trembling on the stage. My husband walked purposefully toward the audio-visual control table situated in the dark corner of the ballroom. The young technician hired for the event took one look at Malcolm's cold, unyielding expression and immediately stepped away from the soundboard. Malcolm picked up the main presentation cable. It was the exact cord meant to display a glorious 60-minute slideshow of my father's life, his corporate triumphs, and his carefully curated family photos. With a swift, practiced motion, Malcolm plugged the cable directly into his own digital tablet. The massive projection screen behind the stage flickered wildly for a second. The Oak Ridge Country Club logo vanished. In its place, a blindingly bright financial spreadsheet illuminated the entire banquet hall. It was massive, towering over my father where he stood frozen at the podium. Rows and rows of dense financial data filled the screen, heavily highlighted in glaring red ink. Trey stared up at the wall, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He recognized those numbers immediately. His arrogant posture completely collapsed, and all the blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a custom-tailored tuxedo. Malcolm stepped back into the center of the room so everyone could see him clearly. "Let us talk about how a logistics empire actually bleeds to death," Malcolm said, projecting his voice with absolute authority. "Your son-in-law Dion stole $1.5 million through his fake real estate company. That is certainly a catastrophic loss for any regional business, but it takes a very special kind of incompetence to drain the remaining $6.5 million of operating capital. Trey suddenly lunged forward, his shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished hardwood floor. "Turn that off!" he screamed, his voice cracking in sheer terror. "You do not have the right to show private company documents in here. That is highly illegal. I am calling the police." Malcolm did not even look at him. He simply tapped the screen of his tablet, magnifying a specific section of the ledger on the wall. The text grew large enough for the investor sitting in the very back row to read clearly. "Notice the recurring line item labeled International Vendor Acquisition," Malcolm instructed, pointing up at the screen like a professor dissecting a corpse. "Over the course of the last 4 years, there are exactly 87 outgoing wire transfers filed under this specific billing code. They average around $75,000 each, sometimes more depending on the season." Winston slumped heavily against the wooden podium, hiding his face from the crowd. He knew exactly what was on that screen. He had spent years trying to bury those exact numbers. "Trey, please explain to the investors sitting in this room what international vendor you were acquiring every single week for 4 years," Malcolm demanded, his tone dropping to a dangerous chill. Trey was hyperventilating now, his chest heaved up and down, and a thick layer of nervous sweat completely ruined his pristine appearance. "It was a consulting firm," he stammered, taking a step backward as several guests leaned forward to stare at him. "It was a logistics consulting firm in South America. Dad approved it. It was for international expansion." Malcolm let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed through the silent room. "It is truly remarkable how comfortable you are with lying, Trey. You lie just as easily as you breathe. But the federal government does not care about your creative stories. They only care about routing numbers. And the routing numbers for these 87 wire transfers do not belong to a South American consulting firm. They belong to a highly sophisticated network of offshore shell accounts controlled by an illegal sports gambling syndicate based in Costa Rica." The collective gasp from the ballroom was deafening. My mother covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with absolute horror, as the pristine image of her golden child was violently ripped away. A prominent local investor sitting at table 3 slammed his fist down on his table, causing his champagne glass to shatter. He had trusted his money with my father, and now he was realizing exactly where it went. Trey did not just lose a little pocket change on Sunday football games, Malcolm continued, his voice striking the room like a physical blow. He has a severe gambling addiction. He placed catastrophic bets on college sports, offshore horse racing, and international soccer matches. He lost consistently and heavily, and every single time he lost, he simply logged into the company accounts and wired your corporate capital to his offshore bookies to keep them from breaking his legs. I stood there watching my brother's golden child persona completely disintegrate into dust. The wealthy guests who had praised him earlier, calling him a brilliant young executive, were now looking at him with utter disgust and fury. He was not a vice president. He was a degenerate gambler who had stolen millions from his own family and their investors to feed his addiction. And yet Trey still tried to deflect the blame. "It is not my fault," Trey wailed, pointing a trembling, sweating finger directly at our father. "I told him I was in trouble. I told him I needed help. He is the one who told me to use the vendor code to hide the money. He is the one who authorized the transfers from the primary account." The room went dead silent. Trey, in his desperate, pathetic attempt to save his own skin, had just publicly confessed to embezzlement and implicated our father in the exact same breath. Winston snapped his head up, his eyes blazing with a mixture of profound betrayal and blinding rage. "Shut your mouth, you stupid, ungrateful boy!" my father hissed, his voice completely raw and broken. "I ruined my entire life to protect you, and you stand there and sell me out to these people." Winston just admitted it. I thought, feeling a cold rush of absolute victory wash over me. The great titan of industry, the man who had ordered me out of his sight, just confessed to federal wire fraud in front of 200 wealthy witnesses. Malcolm nodded slowly, his expression carved from stone. "That is the true tragedy of this family, Winston. You knew your son was embezzling millions of dollars. You knew he was destroying the livelihoods of your warehouse employees and defrauding the investors sitting right here in this room. But instead of cutting him off and holding him accountable, you chose to protect him. You falsified corporate tax returns. You lied to the Internal Revenue Service. You actively covered up multiple federal felonies simply because you could not bear the embarrassment of admitting your perfect golden child was a complete failure. My mother suddenly rushed forward, placing her body between Trey and the rest of the room. She was completely unhinged, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. "Leave him alone!" Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the ballroom. "He is just a young man. Young men make mistakes. You are all blowing this entirely out of proportion. Winston can pay the money back. We will just sell some stock. We can fix this quietly." I could not stay silent any longer. I stepped forward, cutting through my mother's delusional defense. I looked her directly in the eyes, refusing to let her hide behind her fake country club manners for one more second. "A mistake is forgetting to pay a parking ticket." "Brenda," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devastatingly cold. "Embezzling $6.5 million across international borders is a federal felony. And Winston cannot pay the money back because National Apex Freight is seizing every single asset he owns by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. There is no money left. There is no stock to sell. There is no house on the lake. There is no trust fund for Jasmine. You protected a thief because he was your favorite child, and in return, he burned your entire fake empire to the ground." Trey dropped to his knees right there on the polished hardwood floor. He buried his face in his hands, sobbing loudly and uncontrollably. The tough, arrogant executive who had threatened to have me thrown out of the building was entirely gone. In his place was a pathetic, terrified criminal, realizing he was going to spend the next decade of his life in a federal penitentiary. Winston stood completely paralyzed on the stage, his empire projected in bright red numbers right behind him. He looked out at the 200 guests, the elite members of Atlanta society he had spent his entire life trying to impress. They were not applauding anymore. Some were recording the meltdown on their phones. Others were actively standing up, grabbing their coats, and walking out the heavy double doors, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a family currently imploding under a federal criminal investigation. The legacy my father had boasted about 30 minutes ago was completely dead. The empire was gone. And the most beautiful part of it all was that I did not have to lift a single finger to destroy them. They had done it entirely to themselves. I was simply the accountant holding the mirror so they could finally see the horrifying truth of their own reflections. The deafening silence in the ballroom was suddenly shattered by a sound I had never heard my mother make before. It was a visceral, guttural shriek that sounded like a cornered animal. Brenda, the woman who had spent her entire life meticulously curating her high society aesthetic, completely lost her mind. She pushed past the stunned guests, her expensive beaded gown catching on the edge of a wooden chair and tearing audibly. She did not care. She scrambled frantically toward the audio-visual control table in the dark corner of the room. "Turn it off!" she screamed wildly, waving her arms at the terrified young technician who was already backing away from the equipment. She threw herself over the soundboard, grabbing fistfuls of black cables and yanking them with all her might. The massive financial ledger projected on the wall flickered violently before the main power cord snapped out of the socket. The screen went pitch black. The bright red numbers detailing Trey's offshore embezzlement vanished, but it was far too late. The absolute truth had already been burned into the retinas of every single investor in the room. Brenda stood panting heavily, her chest heaving as she gripped the edge of the control table. Her perfectly styled hair was coming undone, falling into her face in a messy tangle. Her expensive mascara was smeared beneath her eyes, making her look hollow and terrifying. She slowly turned around, facing the ballroom. The remaining guests, the very people she had spent decades trying to impress, were staring at her in sheer, absolute horror. They were looking at her not with admiration, but with profound pity and disgust. That realization was the final straw that broke my mother's fragile grip on reality. She could not attack Malcolm because he held the legal power. She could not attack the guests because she still desperately needed their validation. So she did exactly what she had done for 35 years. She turned all of her rage, all of her shame, and all of her failure directly onto me. "You did this," Brenda hissed, pointing a trembling acrylic nail at my face. She marched across the hardwood floor, ignoring her sobbing son and her paralyzed husband. "You planned this, you bitter, evil little girl. You came here tonight specifically to humiliate us." I stood my ground, keeping my posture perfectly straight, as my mother stopped mere inches from me. The heavy scent of her gardenia perfume was now mixed with the sour smell of panicked sweat. "You have always been insanely jealous of them," Brenda screamed, her voice echoing shrilly, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. She gestured wildly toward Trey, who was still curled up on the floor, and then toward Jasmine, who was staring blankly at the wall in a state of shock. "You have spent your entire miserable life plotting against your own blood because you could not stand the fact that they were successful and you were nothing." The sheer audacity of her delusion was staggering. Even as the federal evidence of their fraud sat right in front of her, she was still desperately trying to cling to the narrative that her golden children were superior. Trey was going to be the chief executive officer. She cried out, tears of pure rage streaming down her face. Jasmine married a real estate mogul. They built beautiful lives. They made us proud. They carried the family name with dignity and grace, while you were always the difficult one. You were always the one sitting in the corner quietly judging us. And what did you actually do, Kendra? You sat in the shadows taking notes, trying to find a way to tear down their accomplishments because you knew you could never measure up to them. You are an ungrateful, toxic child. She took another aggressive step forward, trying to use her physical presence to intimidate me, just like she used to do when I was a teenager. "We put a roof over your head," Brenda shouted, poking her finger hard against my shoulder. "We put food on your plate. We bought you clothes. We gave you a life of privilege, and this is how you repay us. By sneaking around with your little accountant job and feeding lies to corporate lawyers so you can steal your father's company. You are just mad because your father cut you off," she continued her rant, becoming more unhinged with every breath. "You are just throwing a massive temper tantrum because he refused to pay your way through life, because he saw through your lazy attitude and knew you would never survive in the corporate world. So you found a way to ruin his retirement. You found a way to destroy your brother's future, just to make yourself feel important. You orchestrated this whole hostile takeover just to punish us for seeing the truth about you." I let her scream. I stood perfectly still and let her hurl every single toxic insult she had stored up over the decades. I watched the ugly reality of her conditional love spill out into the open for everyone to see. She brought up every perceived slight from the past, claiming I purposely ruined family vacations and sabotaged holiday dinners simply by existing. She did not care that Winston had committed federal crimes. She did not care that Trey had stolen millions of dollars from innocent warehouse workers, or that Dion was a complete fraud. She only cared that the money was gone, and she needed a scapegoat to blame for the collapse of her fake kingdom. "You are a monster, Kendra," my mother spat, her face twisted with pure vitriol. "You are entirely dead to me. Do you hear me? You are completely dead to this family. You will never be welcome in our home again." For the first time in my life, her words did not hurt me. They did not make me feel small or inadequate or desperate for her approval. They just sounded incredibly pathetic. I looked at this woman who had spent my entire childhood making me feel like an unwelcome guest in my own home. I looked at the mother who had stood by and watched my siblings mock me, who had actively participated in my financial abuse, and who was now trying to blame me for a hurricane she had helped create with her own blind enabling. The remaining guests were completely silent. Even the country club staff had stopped moving, watching the matriarch of the family publicly self-destruct. Malcolm stood quietly beside me, his presence a steady, immovable mountain of support. He did not step in to defend me this time because he knew I did not need defending. He knew I was holding the final piece of the puzzle and he was waiting for me to play it. Brenda finally stopped yelling. She stood in front of me, gasping for air, her chest heaving, her face an ugly mask of hatred. She was waiting for me to break. She was waiting for me to lower my eyes. apologize, and take the blame, just like I had always done to keep the peace. She honestly believed her loud, aggressive tantrum was going to force me back into submission. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the silence stretch out for a long, uncomfortable moment. I looked at my mother, and then I looked past her to where my father was still gripping the podium, his knuckles white, his eyes completely empty. It was time to show them exactly who they had been underestimating for the last 35 years. It was time to completely shatter the illusion of their superiority and let them drown in the reality of their own incompetence. I looked at my mother and let a cold, calm silence stretch between us. She was still panting heavily, waiting for me to break down and apologize. She wanted me to confirm her twisted narrative that I was just a bitter, jealous little girl acting out for attention. She expected me to lower my head and cry just like I did when I was a teenager, desperately seeking her validation. Instead, I took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. I did not shrink away from her anger. I met her wild eyes with a gaze so steady and unyielding that she actually flinched, taking a half step backward. Jealous. I repeated the word, letting it echo in the quiet ballroom. You honestly believe I did all of this because I am jealous of Trey and Jasmine. You think I am envious of a brother who is currently sobbing on the floor because he is facing a decade in federal prison. You think I want to trade places with a sister whose entire marriage was funded by stolen money and fake real estate deals. You are living in a profound state of delusion, Brenda. There is absolutely nothing in your hollow, fake lives for me to be jealous of. I have never wanted your life. I just wanted you to stop ruining mine. My father gripped the podium, his knuckles still white, his face a mask of panicked confusion. He stared at me as if he was seeing me for the very first time. If you are not jealous, then why did you do this? Winston demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. Why did you spend your time digging through my company files? How did you even get your hands on my private corporate ledgers? You are not authorized to view those documents. I turned my attention away from my mother and looked directly at the man who had ordered me to leave his party just an hour ago. I did not investigate you out of jealousy, Winston, I said, projecting my voice so the entire room could hear the absolute truth. I investigated you because it is my job. Trey lifted his head from his hands, his face red and swollen from crying. Your job, he choked out, letting out a pathetic, bitter laugh. You are a low-level tax accountant, Kendra. You do taxes for small businesses. You sit in a beige cubicle and plug numbers into a computer. You do not have the clearance or the authority to audit a $10 million logistics company. You are nobody. That right there is the fundamental flaw of this entire family, I told my brother, keeping my tone completely clinical and devoid of any sympathy. You never actually paid attention to anything I did. You were all so obsessed with yourselves and your fake status that you never once bothered to ask what my actual job title was. You just assumed I was a failure because it made you feel better about your own profound incompetence. You needed me to be at the bottom so you could pretend you were at the top. I did not go to a cheap state school to learn how to file basic tax returns. Trey, I explained, stepping into the center of the room so every single investor could see me. I went to school to learn how to track stolen money. I am a forensic accountant, and I do not work in a beige cubicle. I am a senior partner at Vanguard Forensic Financials. The name dropped over the room like a heavy iron weight. The wealthy investors sitting at the front tables were completely mesmerized. They were hanging on to every single syllable. The men who had been applauding my father earlier were now looking at me with a mixture of deep respect and sheer terror. In the corporate world, Vanguard Forensic Financials was not just another accounting firm. We were the apex predators of the financial sector. When a massive corporation was suspected of severe money laundering or federal embezzlement, we were the ones the government called in to tear their books apart. When someone with my job title knocked on your door, your company was already dead. Winston staggered slightly, leaning heavily against the wooden stand. Vanguard, he whispered, his voice barely audible. He recognized the name immediately. Any corporate executive with half a brain knew the name of my firm. It was the firm you prayed you never saw in an email subject line. That is right, Winston. I confirmed, offering him a cold, unforgiving smile. We are the largest and most ruthless financial investigation firm in the entire Southeast. And when the Federal Financial Crimes Division noticed the massive discrepancies in your operating budget, they did not send a standard government auditor to look at your books. They knew your logistics empire was hiding something massive. They suspected severe corporate fraud. They needed specialists who could crack offshore accounts and trace dummy corporations. So the Department of Justice contracted Vanguard Forensic Financials to execute a hostile deep dive into every single account tied to your Social Security number. My mother let out a small, horrified gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. She fell backward into an empty chair, unable to support her own weight anymore. She was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what was happening. This was not a petty family dispute. This was not a daughter throwing a tantrum at a party. This was a highly coordinated, targeted federal strike. When the government contract came across my desk, I could have handed it off to one of my junior associates. I continued walking slowly toward the stage. I could have stepped away, citing a conflict of interest. I could have let someone else tear your legacy to pieces. But after 35 years of watching you lie, cheat, and belittle everyone around you, I decided to take the case myself. Jasmine let out another loud sob, rocking back and forth on her heels. She was completely broken, realizing that her little sister, the one she had bullied and mocked her entire life, held the power to destroy her entire world. I was the lead investigator on your audit, Winston. I announced, my voice echoing with devastating finality. I was the one who pulled the public records on Dion's fake shell company. I was the one who traced Trey's 87 wire transfers to Costa Rica. I was the one who uncovered your illegal leveraging of the employee pension fund. And I was the one who handed the final 1,000-page forensic report directly to the federal prosecutors on Tuesday morning, resulting in the immediate freeze of all your assets. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. The guests were completely frozen, watching a daughter surgically destroy her father's criminal empire right before their eyes. I had not just exposed them to their friends. I had legally, systematically dismantled their entire existence. Every single lie they had ever told was now documented, stamped, and filed in a federal courthouse. You destroyed your own family! Brenda whimpered from her chair, tears ruining the front of her expensive silk dress. You destroyed your own flesh and blood. How could you do this to us? I did not destroy anything, Brenda. I corrected her, keeping my voice perfectly steady and devoid of emotion. I simply did my job. I followed the numbers. The numbers do not lie. The numbers do not care about your country club aesthetic. They do not care about your golden child or your fake real estate mogul son-in-law. The numbers only show the truth. You destroyed this family when you decided to build an empire on stolen money and toxic lies. I just turned on the lights so everyone could finally see the cockroaches scatter. My father looked like a man who had been struck by lightning. The arrogance, the pride, the overwhelming sense of superiority, it was all completely gone. He was staring at the woman he had always considered his biggest disappointment, realizing that she was the smartest, most powerful person he had ever met in his entire life. He had spent decades trying to prune the dead branch from his family tree, completely unaware that the branch he was trying to cut was actually the only thing holding the entire tree together. My father looked at me with a dawning realization, but his massive ego still refused to accept the complete picture. He shook his head slowly, gripping the sides of the podium as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. Even if you are a partner at Vanguard, he choked out, his voice sounding hollow and desperate, you are still just an employee on a payroll. You do not have the kind of capital to rent out this country club on a whim. You are trying to act like a millionaire, but I know exactly what accountants make. You are drowning in student loans, Jasmine said it herself. I let out a soft sigh. It was genuinely exhausting watching a man who claimed to be a business genius fundamentally misunderstand how true wealth actually functioned. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he could not comprehend a reality where I was not financially beneath him. I am not on a payroll, Winston, I explained, speaking to him slowly and clearly. I am an equity partner. Do you know what happens when Vanguard Forensic Financials uncovers a $100 million corporate fraud case? We do not charge an hourly rate. We take a massive percentage of the recovered assets. I have personally led 6 international audits in the last 2 years alone. My quarterly distribution check, the money I take home every 3 months, is larger than the highest gross annual revenue your little logistics company has ever generated in its entire 35-year history. The guests in the room were dead silent, absorbing the sheer scale of the financial disparity between us. My mother, Brenda, who was still slumped in her chair, let out a weak, whimpering sound. The daughter she had just called a poor, bitter failure was standing in front of her, possessing a level of wealth the family had only ever pretended to have. I am not acting like a millionaire, Winston, I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. I have built a personal net worth that makes your fake suburban country club lifestyle look like absolute pocket change. The difference between us is that I do not need to lease luxury cars or wear flashy diamond necklaces to prove my worth to strangers. I do not have to put on a daily masquerade to hide a crumbling empire because my empire is actually real. Winston shook his head rapidly, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. If you are so incredibly rich, he stammered, a look of desperate panic crossing his face, then why did you let my company fail? If you knew Trey was stealing, why did you not step in and save us? You let my legacy collapse just to spite me. You could have fixed this, Kendra. You could have written a check. I let the words hang in the air, tasting the bitter irony of his accusation. He was still trying to play the victim. He was still trying to make his failures my responsibility. I let it collapse, I repeated, keeping my eyes locked on his trembling frame. Winston, who do you think has been paying your commercial warehouse leases for the last 5 years? Winston froze. His jaw tightened, and he stared at me in absolute confusion. What are you talking about? He demanded. We secured private funding. We brought on a silent angel investor when the banks unjustly restricted our credit lines. An anonymous angel investor operating under a blind trust called the KW Holdings Group, I said, watching his eyes widen drastically as his brain finally connected the initials. When the traditional banks took one look at your chaotic ledgers and laughed you out of their offices, you miraculously received a $2 million cash injection, and then another million the following year, and another million after that to keep your trucks on the road. I stepped closer to the stage, refusing to let him look away. Remember December 3 years ago when your payroll accounts bounced and you were 48 hours away from mass employee walkouts? I asked him, detailing the exact crisis he had desperately tried to keep secret. You received an emergency wire transfer that covered the deficit and paid every single driver their holiday bonus. You honestly believed some benevolent billionaire saw potential in your failing regional freight company. Winston gripped his chest, his face turning an unhealthy shade of pale gray. He was struggling to breathe as the truth finally crushed the last remaining pillar of his pride. There was no billionaire, Winston, I said, my voice laced with a mixture of cold authority and lingering sorrow. It was me. I was the angel investor. I was the KW Holdings Group. I am the only reason your company survived long enough for you to even plan this ridiculous retirement dinner. The collective gasp from the ballroom was undeniable. Several prominent investors at the front tables physically recoiled, completely stunned by the revelation. Jasmine, who was still huddled on the floor, looked up at me with tears streaming down her face, her expression twisted in absolute disbelief. The sister she had mocked for wearing an off-the-rack dress had secretly been paying the salary that funded her entire trust fund. Dion stared at me, his mouth hanging open, realizing that the money he had been stealing actually belonged to me. I poured millions of my own hard-earned dollars into your sinking ship, I confessed, laying bare the most vulnerable part of my past for the entire room to witness. Not because your company was a good investment, it was a terrible financial decision. Any junior analyst would have told me to walk away. But I did it because I was foolish enough to believe that if I kept your precious legacy alive, you might eventually look at me the way you look at Trey. I paused, letting the heavy emotion of those wasted years settle over the crowd. I thought that if I quietly fixed your financial disasters, you would finally realize my worth. I bought you 5 extra years of this fake billionaire lifestyle, hoping that one day you would simply love me. I wanted to be your daughter, Winston. I wanted to sit at the family table and feel like I belonged. My mother let out a loud, agonizing sob, burying her face in her hands. She was finally realizing the catastrophic cost of her endless cruelty. She had spent decades alienating the only person who had ever truly tried to protect them. But tonight cured me of that delusion permanently. I stated, feeling the final emotional chains snapping and falling away from my shoulders. I sat at a table in the back corner of the room holding an envelope that contained the truth of your impending arrest. I came here to warn you. I came here to give you a chance to prepare a legal defense. And instead of greeting me, you stood on a stage and told 200 people that I was a dead branch bringing shame to your perfect aesthetic. You looked me in the eye and ordered me out of your life. Winston raised a trembling hand, reaching out toward me, as if he could somehow rewind the clock and take back the cruel toast he had made just an hour ago. Kendra, please, he rasped, his voice completely broken. I did not know. I swear to you, I did not know it was you. It would not have mattered if you did. I replied, my voice echoing with absolute finality. You only love people for what they can do for your image. But I am officially done subsidizing your delusions. As the primary silent investor, I have legally initiated an immediate withdrawal of all remaining capital from the KW Holdings Group. I am pulling the financial life support from your logistics company. Trey let out a miserable wail from the floor, curling into a tight ball of despair. The golden child was completely broken. I am not saving your warehouses, I announced, turning my back on my father and looking at my devastated siblings and my weeping mother. I am not paying your legal fees when the Department of Justice files criminal charges against you and your son tomorrow morning. You told me to leave Winston. You told me I was not part of this family. So I am giving you exactly what you asked for. I am taking my money, my husband, and my dignity, and I am leaving you to face the consequences of your own arrogance. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, closing the final physical gap between me and the man who had tormented me for 3 decades. I raised my right hand, lifting the simple manila envelope I had been carrying all evening. It was the exact same folder Jasmine had mocked 30 minutes ago. The same envelope my mother had assumed was a pathetic plea for a loan. I held it out toward my father, letting it hover in the empty space between us. Take it, Winston, I commanded, my voice echoing off the high ceiling with absolute authority. Open your retirement gift. Winston stared at the beige paper as if it were a loaded weapon. His chest was heaving, and a thick sheen of cold sweat coated his forehead. He did not want to touch it. He knew that taking that envelope meant officially accepting the reality of his own destruction. But with 200 elite guests watching his every move, and Malcolm standing right behind me ready to legally enforce every single word I said, Winston had absolutely no choice. He reached out. His hands were shaking so violently that he could barely grasp the edge of the folder. He pulled it toward his chest, his breathing ragged and shallow. Open it, I instructed again, refusing to give him a single second of mercy. Winston hooked his trembling finger under the flap and tore it open. The sound of ripping paper was incredibly loud in the dead silent ballroom. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of crisp white legal documents. They were not bound like standard corporate reports. They were fastened with heavy brass brads and the top of every single page bore the unmistakable dark blue seal of the United States Department of Justice. Winston stared at the cover page, his eyes darting frantically across the bold black text. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just read his own obituary. "It is not a handmade card, Winston," I said, making sure my voice carried to the wealthy investors sitting in the back row. "What you are holding in your hands is a federal subpoena demanding your immediate appearance in front of a grand jury." My father flipped to the second page, his fingers fumbling awkwardly. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse wearing a custom tuxedo. And beneath that, I continued narrating his downfall for the entire room to hear, is the formal notice of immediate asset seizure signed by a federal judge this afternoon. It grants the government the absolute right to confiscate your bank accounts, your luxury vehicles, the deed to this logistics company, and your primary residence to satisfy the massive debts you accumulated through fraud. Winston shook his head rapidly back and forth in a state of absolute denial. "No," he whispered, the microphone picking up the desperate, raspy sound. "They cannot take the house. It is in Brenda's name. The federal government does not care whose name is on the deed when the mortgage was paid with stolen corporate funds," I corrected him coldly. "They are taking the house, Winston. They are taking the lake cabin. They are taking everything you bought with dirty money." Winston flipped to the third page, and his knees visibly buckled. He stumbled backward, hitting the heavy wooden podium to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. The papers slipped from his loose grip, scattering across the polished stage like dead leaves falling from a rotting tree. My mother let out a sharp, terrified gasp from her chair. She pushed herself up and rushed to the edge of the stage, grabbing one of the fallen papers. She stared at the dense legal jargon, her eyes widening in pure horror as she saw her husband's name printed next to a list of federal criminal codes. "The document currently resting by your expensive leather shoes is your formal indictment," I announced, my voice dropping into a dark, unyielding register. "You are being officially charged with multiple counts of corporate wire fraud, severe tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit money laundering." The guests in the ballroom began to move. The morbid curiosity that had kept them in their seats was completely shattered by the word indictment. Being in the same room as a failing businessman was a social faux pas, but being in the same room as an indicted federal criminal was a massive liability. Men in expensive suits began grabbing their wives' arms, rushing toward the double doors at the back of the hall. The mass exodus had officially begun. They were abandoning Winston just as quickly as they had applauded him. Trey, who was still curled on the floor, let out a high-pitched wailing sound. He crawled toward the stage, his hands scrambling across the hardwood floor until he grabbed another loose page. He saw his own name printed in bold black ink right beneath our father's. He was named as a direct co-conspirator in the international embezzlement scheme. "I am going to prison!" Trey shrieked hysterically, tearing at the collar of his shirt as if it were suddenly choking him. "They are going to lock me up. Dad, you promised you would fix it. You promised me they would not find the Costa Rica accounts." "Shut up!" Winston roared, kicking out blindly at his son. He was completely unhinged, his perfect executive mask entirely gone. He looked wild and feral, cornered by the undeniable truth of his own actions. "You thought tonight was a celebration of your legacy, Winston," I said, stepping back to stand beside Malcolm as the chaotic reality set in. "You thought you were going to walk away into a golden retirement while you left me to pick up the scraps of your affection. But this envelope is the only legacy you actually built." I looked at the scattered federal documents covering the stage. "That is your retirement gift, Winston," I told him, feeling the heavy burden of my childhood finally lift from my shoulders. "It is the absolute end of your freedom. By Monday morning, there will be federal agents waiting at the front door of your massive house. They will put you in handcuffs. They will put your golden child in handcuffs. And all of your country club friends, the people you cared about more than your own daughter, will watch it happen on the evening news." Winston dropped to his knees on the stage, surrounded by the official papers that detailed his absolute ruin. He covered his face with his hands, weeping openly in front of the empty tables and the half-eaten plates of expensive food. The empire was gone, the money was gone, and the freedom he took for granted had just been ripped from his hands. I watched him cry and I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness, just the cold, clean satisfaction of a forensic accountant closing a very long and very difficult case. The illusion of family loyalty evaporated the exact second the reality of federal prison set in. Dion, who had been standing frozen near table 24, suddenly snapped out of his shock. He lunged toward the scattered papers on the stage, snatching up a page that had his dummy shell company named in bold print. He read the text, his face contorting into a mask of pure selfish panic. He realized in that moment that he was not just losing his fake real estate money. He was going down with the sinking ship and facing severe criminal charges for his role in the embezzlement. He turned around and glared at Jasmine. Jasmine was still sitting on the floor, her designer dress ruined, her face streaked with mascara. She reached a hand out toward her husband, desperately needing comfort, in the midst of her entire world collapsing. But Dion did not reach back. He smacked her hand away with a viciousness that made my mother scream out in shock. "I am not going to prison for your father," Dion shouted, his voice echoing with absolute panic, cutting through the ambient noise of fleeing guests. "I am not taking the fall for this garbage. You told me your family was untouchable, Jasmine. You told me I was marrying into a corporate dynasty. You are nothing but a bunch of broke criminals." Jasmine gasped, clutching her chest, as if she had been physically shot. "Dion, please," she begged, crawling toward him, her high society facade entirely completely shattered. "We are husband and wife. We can fight this together. We can hire lawyers." "Fight it with what money?" Dion spat back, looking down at her with profound disgust. "Your trust fund is empty. My accounts are frozen. I am filing for divorce first thing Monday morning. I am calling a federal defense attorney tonight, and I am giving the prosecutors every single piece of dirt I have on your father to save myself. I am completely done with you and this pathetic family." Jasmine let out a devastating wail, curling into a ball on the floor. Her marriage was over in less than 60 seconds. The man she thought loved her had only ever loved the unrestricted access to her father's bank accounts. While Dion and Jasmine were loudly tearing their marriage apart in front of the remaining guests, my brother Trey saw an opportunity. The golden child, the man who had bragged about taking over a $10 million logistics empire just an hour ago, was now behaving like an absolute coward. He scrambled away from the stage, leaving our father weeping alone amidst the legal documents. Trey stood up, brushing the dust off his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket, and began rapidly inching toward the swinging wooden doors that led to the country club kitchen. He was trying to slip out the back exit and abandon his own parents to face the federal authorities entirely alone. He pushed through the heavy wooden doors, but he did not make it more than 3 steps. Malcolm had already anticipated my brother's cowardice. Mr. Harrison, the banquet manager, had quietly instructed his security team to follow Malcolm's orders to the letter, realizing that Malcolm was the only person in the room with actual legal and financial power. As Trey tried to sprint through the busy kitchen, pushing past the shocked catering staff, 2 massive security guards stepped directly into his path. They grabbed Trey by the arms, lifting him entirely off his feet. Trey thrashed and kicked violently, knocking over a tall metal tray of expensive crystal champagne glasses. The glasses shattered loudly against the kitchen tile, a sharp crashing sound that echoed back into the main ballroom. "Let me go," Trey screamed, his voice cracking in sheer terror. "You cannot touch me. Do you know who my father is? I will have you fired. Let me go right now." One of the guards easily pinned Trey's arms behind his back, marching him right back out through the swinging doors and into the bright light of the banquet hall. Trey struggled helplessly, his feet dragging across the polished floor, his expensive shoes scuffing the wood. "He is not going anywhere," Malcolm said, his voice projecting calmly over the chaos. "The federal agents are currently en route to this location to execute the arrest warrants. If he attempts to flee the property again, feel free to restrain him physically until the authorities arrive to process him. Trey began to sob uncontrollably, sagging against the firm grip of the security guards. He was a completely broken and pathetic sight. My mother ran over to him, weeping wildly, grabbing at the guards' heavy arms and trying to pull their hands off her son. She shrieked at them, demanding they release her baby boy, but the guards ignored her entirely, standing like stone statues. I turned my attention back to the stage. Winston had watched the entire scene unfold in brutal, agonizing slow motion. He watched his son-in-law viciously abandon his oldest daughter, treating her like a diseased liability. He watched his golden child, the son he had committed federal felonies to protect, try to run away and leave him to rot in a prison cell. He watched the remaining elite guests, the local politicians and the wealthy investors, pointing at his family and whispering with absolute sheer disgust. The pristine reputation Winston had spent 35 years building at the expense of my mental health and my happiness was entirely pulverized in a matter of minutes. He had sacrificed everything for the sake of his public image, and now that image was permanently destroyed. Winston slowly pulled himself up from the floor, using the heavy wooden podium for support. His hands shook violently. He looked out at the empty tables, the abandoned half-eaten plates of prime rib, the spilled wine, and the scattered federal documents detailing his massive crimes. He let out a long, ragged breath that sounded horribly like a death rattle. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily into a plush banquet chair placed near the edge of the stage, falling into it, like a puppet whose strings had just been violently cut. His arms dangled uselessly at his sides. He stared blankly ahead, completely paralyzed by the magnitude of his ruin. The bright, warm light of the crystal chandeliers beamed down on him, highlighting the deep wrinkles on his face and the hollow, empty look in his eyes. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was no longer a powerful patriarch demanding respect and obedience from his children. He was just a terrified, broke criminal waiting for the police sirens to wail in the distance. He had spent his entire life judging everyone around him, sorting people into categories of winners and losers based on their bank accounts. And now, according to his own ruthless metric, he was the biggest loser in the entire city of Atlanta. My mother abandoned her futile attempt to free Trey and rushed over to the stage, falling to her knees beside Winston's chair. She grabbed his arm, shaking him, begging him to do something to fix the nightmare. "Winston, Winston, please talk to me," Brenda cried. Her makeup smeared completely across her cheeks. "Tell me you have a hidden account. Tell me you have a lawyer who can make this go away. We cannot lose the country club membership. We cannot lose the house." But Winston did not look at her. He did not speak a single word of comfort. He just stared straight ahead into the empty void of the banquet hall. I stood beside Malcolm, feeling the cool, crisp air conditioning of the ballroom wash over me. For 35 years, I had desperately wanted to be invited to this table. I had wanted to sit with them, laugh with them, and feel the warmth of their approval. But as I looked at the wreckage of my family sitting there in the ruins of their own arrogance and greed, I realized I had been saved from a terrible fate. They were drowning in a toxic ocean of their own making, and for the first time in my life, I had absolutely no desire to throw them a life preserver. My mother stopped shaking Winston's arm. She knelt there on the floor of the stage, looking up at his blank, empty face, and finally understood that the well was completely dry. There was no secret lawyer waiting in the wings to save them. There was no hidden offshore account holding millions of dollars in reserve. The man she had worshipped for his wealth and status was nothing more than an empty shell about to be hauled away in federal handcuffs. I watched a terrifying transformation wash over my mother. It happened in the span of perhaps 10 seconds. The furious, screaming woman who had just called me a monster and told me I was entirely dead to her vanished completely. The woman who had proudly called security on my husband just a few minutes ago was suddenly gone. In her place, a desperate, calculating survivor emerged. She realized with absolute clarity that the only person in the entire country club who still had a functioning bank account was standing right in front of her. Brenda slowly stood up from the floor. She reached down and tried to smooth out the torn fabric of her expensive beaded gown, but her hands were trembling too violently to make a difference. She took a hesitant step toward me and then another. Her eyes darted from my face to Malcolm's and then back to me. The harsh, arrogant lines of her face softened into a pathetic mask of manufactured maternal vulnerability. She closed the distance between us, reaching out with both hands. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into the fabric of my dress. Her grip was incredibly tight, but it was not the aggressive grip she had used to hold me back earlier. It was the frantic, clinging grip of a drowning woman reaching for a life raft. "Kendra, baby," she whispered, her voice trembling heavily, pitching up into a sweet, pleading tone that made my stomach turn. "You have to help us." I stared down at her hands on my arm, and then looked up into her tear-streaked face. I did not pull away immediately. I wanted to hear exactly how far she was willing to go to save herself. "You cannot let them do this to me," Brenda cried, fresh tears spilling over her eyelashes. "You cannot let them take the house, Kendra." "Where am I supposed to go? All of my friends live in that neighborhood. My entire life is in that house. You have the money. You just said you make millions. You can hire the best defense attorneys in the country. You can pay off the federal investigators. You can fix this for us, baby. We are your family." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the cold air of the ballroom. She was actually asking me, the daughter she had emotionally abused and financially neglected for 35 years, to drain my own hard-earned wealth to buy her out of federal treason. I looked over at Trey, who was still sobbing while being pinned against the kitchen doors by the security guards. I looked at Jasmine, who was sitting alone on the floor, abandoned by her fraud of a husband. And then I looked back at my mother. "We can leave your father," Brenda suddenly whispered, leaning closer to me, her voice dropping into a frantic, conspiratorial tone. She was actively throwing her husband of 40 years under the bus without a single second of hesitation. "I did not know what he was doing, Kendra. I swear to you. I did not know he was stealing. He kept all the finances a secret. You and me, we can walk out of here right now. I can come live with you and Malcolm. I will leave Winston to deal with this mess on his own. Just take me with you, baby. Please." It was the ultimate betrayal. Brenda had no loyalty to anyone. She did not love Winston. She did not even love Trey or Jasmine. She only loved the comfort and the power that their proximity provided her. And the absolute second they became a liability, she was ready to discard them and latch on to me. 10 years ago, this moment would have broken me. 10 years ago, if my mother had looked at me with tears in her eyes and called me her baby, I would have emptied my bank accounts to save her. I would have set myself on fire just to keep her warm, hoping that my sacrifice would finally earn her genuine affection. But looking at her now, I felt nothing but a profound sense of exhaustion. The spell was completely broken. I did not yank my arm away. I moved slowly and deliberately. I reached over with my free hand and gently peeled her fingers off my arm one by one. I stepped back, creating a solid physical boundary between us. "Do not ever call me your baby," I said, my voice low and perfectly steady. "You lost the right to use that word a very long time ago." Brenda let out a wounded gasp, clutching her hands to her chest as if I had physically struck her. "Kendra, please," she begged, taking another step forward. "You cannot turn your back on your own flesh and blood. You are a good person. You are my daughter." "You knew, Brenda," I interrupted, slicing through her pathetic performance with the cold, hard truth. "Do not stand there and lie to my face telling me you had no idea what Winston and Trey were doing. You knew exactly what they were. You saw the offshore bank statements. You saw Dion inflating his invoices. You chose to look the other way because confronting the truth meant you might have to give up your country club membership and your weekly spa treatments. You were perfectly happy to fund your high society aesthetic with stolen money." She opened her mouth to deny it, but no words came out. She knew I was right. As a forensic accountant, I had seen the credit card bills. I knew exactly how much stolen corporate capital she had personally spent on luxury vacations and designer wardrobes. You stood by and watched Winston cut me off when I was 18 years old. I reminded her, letting the decades of history finally settle the score. You watched me work night shifts at a diner just to pay for my textbooks while you bought Jasmine a brand new car just for passing her classes. You sat at that table tonight and laughed while Jasmine humiliated me. You called security and tried to have me thrown out into the street. And 5 minutes ago, you looked me dead in the eye and told me I was a monster who was entirely dead to you. I paused, letting the weight of her own actions crush the last remaining breath of hope out of her lungs. You do not want a daughter, Brenda, I told her, watching the reality completely break her spirit. You want an ATM. You want a shield to hide behind when the consequences of your own toxic behavior finally catch up to you. But I am not playing that role anymore. I am not your scapegoat, and I am certainly not your savior. My mother began to weep loudly, a horrible, desperate sound that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. She dropped to her knees right there in front of me, her expensive gown pooling around her on the hardwood floor. She grabbed the hem of my simple navy blue dress, sobbing uncontrollably, begging me not to leave her alone. It was a pathetic, devastating sight, but it did not move me. I looked down at her, and then I looked over at my father, who was still paralyzed in his chair. I remembered the exact words Winston had spoken into the microphone when he raised his crystal glass at the beginning of the night. The words that had been meant to destroy me in front of all these elite guests. The words that were now going to serve as the perfect epitaph for this entire family. I gently pulled the fabric of my dress out of my mother's grasping hands. I took one final step backward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Malcolm. I looked directly into my mother's tear-filled eyes and I weaponized their own cruelty against them. Only the children who make you proud are yours, remember. I asked, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity, completely devoid of any sympathy. You just said it yourself. Winston said it in front of 200 people. You do not claim the dead branches. Brenda shook her head frantically, holding her hands up in a desperate plea. No, Kendra. Please, we did not mean it. You ordered me to leave, I stated, delivering the final undeniable verdict. So I am leaving. I did not wait for her to respond. I did not offer her a single word of comfort or a single dollar of my money. I simply turned my back on her. I turned my back on my weeping brother, my completely ruined sister, and my paralyzed father. I left them surrounded by the scattered federal documents that detailed their absolute destruction. They had built their entire lives on a foundation of lies, and now they were going to have to live in the rubble. The heavy oak doors of the country club dining room swung shut instantly, muffling the chaotic symphony of shattered glass, frantic accusations, and my mother's hysterical sobbing. The sudden quiet of the grand marble foyer wrapped around me like a protective shield. I kept my shoulders pulled back and my spine perfectly straight, refusing to let my posture betray even a fraction of a second of doubt. For 32 years, I had been systematically conditioned to turn around. I was trained to apologize for their mistakes, to open my checkbook on command, and to smooth over the jagged edges of their catastrophic choices so they could maintain their flawless public image. I was the designated fixer, the financial safety net, the scapegoat they kept around only because I was useful. Not tonight. I kept walking toward the exit, my heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the polished floor. Malcolm walked right beside me, his presence a solid, calming anchor in the wake of the storm we had just unleashed. He did not ask if I was okay, or if I needed a moment to process the destruction of my family unit. He did not ask if I wanted to go back inside to soften the blow. He simply offered his arm, and I took it, feeling the steady strength of a true equal partnership. We reached the valet stand, just as the crisp autumn wind swept across the pristine circular driveway. The cold air hit my face sharp and biting, but it felt remarkably like freedom. It swept away the suffocating scent of my mother's expensive floral perfume and the stale, suffocating stench of my father's desperate financial lies. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs completely for what felt like the first time in my entire adult life. The valet, a young man who had watched my family treat the club staff like indentured servants for a decade, brought my car around. He handed me the keys with a small, knowing smile and a highly respectful nod. He had heard the screaming echoing down the halls. Everyone in the building had. I tipped him generously, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. Malcolm settled into the passenger side, adjusting his suit jacket with a satisfied sigh. We drove down the winding tree-lined avenue of the exclusive club, leaving the manicured lawns and the toxic illusions of high society far behind us in the rearview mirror. My phone began to vibrate violently in my purse, lighting up the dark interior of the car, with rapid-fire texts and missed calls from my father, my mother, and Trey. I reached into my bag, pulled out the device, and calmly powered it down completely. The screen went black, cutting off their access to me forever. The silence in the car was not heavy or fraught with unsaid things. It was a comfortable, expansive quiet. I kept waiting for the familiar crushing wave of guilt to wash over me. I had been taught since childhood that choosing myself was the ultimate betrayal against the family. I expected the panicked voice in my head to tell me I had destroyed my parents, that I was a terrible daughter, that I needed to turn the car around and fix the massive financial mess I had left in that dining room. The guilt never came. I searched my heart for a shred of remorse and found absolutely nothing but clean, bright space. The dark corner where my anxiety and obligation used to live was completely empty, replaced by a profound, unshakable relief. The parasite of their relentless expectations had finally been severed. I glanced over at Malcolm as we merged onto the main highway leading back to the city. He was watching me with a look of pure, unadulterated admiration. "You did it," he said softly, his voice full of pride. "You actually cut the cord." I smiled, feeling the chronic tension drain out of my jaw and my neck for good. "I did not just cut the cord," I replied, keeping my eyes on the open road stretching out before us. "I burned the entire bridge to the ground." We drove into the bright city lights, the skyline glowing like a promise of a new life. I was no longer the family bank account. I was no longer the emotional punching bag. I was just Kendra, and for the first time, that was more than enough. 6 months passed, with the rapid, clarifying speed of a wildfire burning away decades of dead brush. Spring arrived in the city, bringing with it a season of absolute consequence for the people who had spent their entire lives believing they were totally untouchable. I sat in my sleek corner office, sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reviewing my firm's spectacular quarterly reports. My independent investment portfolio had tripled in size. Without the constant massive drain of covering my family's hidden debts and funding their extravagant fake lifestyles, my wealth had compounded exponentially. I was currently closing a multi-million-dollar funding round for a coalition of women-led tech startups, using my vast resources to build talented people up rather than constantly bailing out incompetent relatives. I had earned the fierce respect of the financial district, no longer operating in the shadow of my father's fraudulent empire. Meanwhile, the legacy my father had built on deception and theft completely collapsed into dust. The Securities and Exchange Commission did not care about the Winston family name or their country club memberships. Following the meticulous paper trail of offshore accounts and forged documents I had handed over, federal investigators ruthlessly dismantled his company piece by piece. Federal agents raided his corporate headquarters, carrying out boxes of hard drives and files in full view of the local news cameras. His personal and business assets were entirely frozen, his offshore accounts seized, and the business he had valued far above his own daughter was fully liquidated to pay back the hundreds of defrauded investors. He is currently sitting in a cheap rented townhouse, wearing off-the-rack suits he bought on discount, awaiting a high-profile federal trial. His overwhelmed public defender has already advised him to take a plea deal because he has absolutely no chance of winning in front of a jury. Trey, the golden boy who could do no wrong, finally faced a massive problem my money could not magically solve. The federal wire fraud and gross embezzlement charges caught up to him with brutal, unforgiving efficiency. In a desperate, cowardly attempt to save himself from prison, he tried to testify against our father, offering to trade family secrets to the prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. The federal investigators literally laughed at his offer. They already had all the pristine evidence they needed from my files. Trey is currently facing 10 to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, his prestigious Ivy League degrees, and charming smile entirely useless against the Department of Justice. Jasmine and Dion's picture-perfect, highly curated marriage shattered the very moment the financial pipeline was permanently cut. Without my silent, constant funding, artificially propping up Dion's failing real estate ventures, his business went under in less than 60 days. The crushing stress of impending bankruptcy and creditors calling their cell phones day and night destroyed their public image. Jasmine filed for a messy, highly public divorce when she realized Dion was completely broke. They are currently locked in a bitter legal battle, aggressively fighting over negative assets, repossessed luxury vehicles, and mountains of credit card debt. Jasmine has resorted to selling her prized designer handbags on internet resale sites just to make her minimum rent payments. Their social media accounts, once filled with luxury vacations and expensive champagne toasts, have gone completely dark. But the most poetic, satisfying justice belonged to my mother Brenda. Swiftly evicted from the sprawling estate she had treated like her personal kingdom, she was forced to move into a cramped, dimly lit two-bedroom apartment near a noisy interstate highway. The high society friends she had prized more than my emotional well-being dropped her the instant the embezzlement scandal broke. In her shallow world, financial ruin is a highly contagious disease, and she was swiftly blacklisted from every gala luncheon and charity board in the entire city. I heard through the corporate grapevine that she recently tried to attend a botanical society spring mixer, pretending nothing was wrong, and was politely but firmly turned away by security at the front door. I sipped my artisanal coffee, looking at the small stack of sorted mail on my glass desk. Sitting right on top was a handwritten letter from my mother. I recognized the frantic looping cursive immediately. 6 months ago, seeing her handwriting on an envelope would have sent my heart rate skyrocketing into a full panic attack. I would have opened it with trembling hands, bracing myself for the emotional manipulation, the heavy guilt trips, and the inevitable desperate demand for cash to save them from ruin. Today, I simply picked up the unopened envelope, walked over to the corner of my office, and dropped it directly into the heavy-duty paper shredder. The machine whirred to life, rapidly slicing her desperate words into meaningless tiny strips of confetti. I turned my back on the shredder without a second thought and walked out to the glass-walled conference room where Malcolm and my elite team were waiting to pitch a highly lucrative new venture. The toxic past was dead, the financial debts were settled, and my brilliant future was entirely my own. That afternoon in the conference room felt like a definitive coronation. We closed the new venture seamlessly, marking just one of many professional and personal victories that followed my decision to permanently walk away. When I stepped out of the office building later that evening, the city felt entirely different. It was no longer a stressful battleground where I had to constantly defend my emotional boundaries and fiercely protect my bank accounts. It had become a vibrant landscape of endless possibilities. Malcolm took my hand as we walked toward our favorite neighborhood bistro. There were no frantic phone calls interrupting our dinner. There were no manufactured hysterical emergencies requiring a massive wire transfer before we even ordered dessert. There was only the quiet, steady, beautiful hum of a normal, healthy life. For the first time in my 32 years on Earth, I actually knew what true peace tasted like, and it was infinitely sweeter than any elaborate revenge I could have ever orchestrated. Later that night, we sat on the private balcony of our penthouse, wrapped in thick blankets, watching the city skyline glow against the dark sky. I rested my hands on the subtle, newly forming curve of my stomach. I was 4 months pregnant with our first child, a little girl. Years ago, the mere thought of bringing a daughter into this world would have terrified me. I used to be deeply afraid that I would subconsciously replicate the toxic, highly conditional love my mother had inflicted upon me. I was terrified I would view my child as a prop, an extension of my own ego, or a convenient tool for social climbing. But as I felt a tiny flutter against my palm, that old fear completely dissolved. I knew with absolute certainty that this baby would never know the heavy, suffocating burden of having to earn her right to exist in her own home. She would never be asked to sacrifice her happiness, her savings, or her sanity to protect a fragile family lie. The generational curse of the Winston family stops right here permanently with me. I will never look at my daughter and see a designated scapegoat or a convenient financial safety net. She will be loved simply because she is breathing. Malcolm wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his large hands gently over mine on my belly. We had spent countless hours talking about the exact kind of parents we wanted to be. We were intentionally building a solid foundation based on radical honesty, emotional safety, and unwavering support. I had barely survived a household where love was treated as a highly scarce transactional currency handed out only when I served a specific, usually financial purpose. Now I was creating a home where love is a constant, endlessly renewable resource. I did not lose a family that night at the country club. I simply made room for my real one. My recent baby shower was a perfect testament to this beautiful new reality. There were no society photographers, no extravagant catered caviar to impress strangers, and no superficial country club acquaintances quietly judging the floral arrangements. Instead, my living room was filled with brilliant women from my startup coalition, fiercely loyal friends who had stood by me during the chaotic fallout of my father's federal indictment, and Malcolm's warm relatives who embraced me instantly, without ever asking for a dime. Looking around that room filled with genuine laughter, I realized I had completely detoxified my environment. Blood simply makes you related, but loyalty, respect, and mutual care are what actually make you a family. I look back at the desperate woman who used to eagerly hand over her black card just to buy a fleeting, fake moment of her parents' approval, and I hardly recognize her. The wealth I built was a powerful tool, but my true secret weapon was the ultimate unshakable realization of my own self-worth. I took back my narrative, I protected my energy, and I built an impenetrable fortress of happiness. My relatives thought they could bleed me dry forever, assuming I was too weak and too conditioned to ever cut the cord. They were catastrophically wrong. Sometimes the trash takes itself out. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe.